Hi guys, tonight we are stepping straight into a world where the cold does not politely knock at your door, but barges in with the force of an invader. It insinuates itself through every chink in the wall, every gap in the timber, and curls around your very bones before you even manage a weary yawn. Picture yourself in the deepest heart of a medieval winter, where dawn is a reluctant, grey promise on the horizon. Frost has been at work all night, painting intricate white lace on the edges of your tiny window, and a draught so sharp, so malicious, it feels like a shard of ice dragged across the exposed skin of your neck. You pull whatever ragged, straw-stuffed blanket you can find closer, a futile gesture against the onslaught, but it offers almost nothing. The truth is stark. You probably won't survive this night without the holy trinity of medieval warmth: fire, bodies, or sheer unyielding stubbornness. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and your local time in the comments. I truly love imagining where in the world all of you are listening from, sharing this moment in time. Now, dim the lights. Your toes curl instinctively against the rough rush matting on the floor. It feels damp, a chilling wetness that persists even though it's frozen solid. That is the fundamental nature of medieval mornings. A cold that seeps into your soul. A dampness that clings like a second skin. The air itself is so heavy and crystalline with frost that every single breath feels like an act of abrasion, a painful burning in your throat. The first sound you register is not the cheerful melody of birdsong, but the mournful crack and groan of timber as the cottage's very bones contract under the immense pressure of the night's frost. And you, wrapped in a coarse woolen tunic that scratches at your skin, tug desperately at the edges of a thin blanket stuffed with straw, hoping some small part of you can find a memory of warmth. Daily life in this era begins and ends with the inescapable reality of cold. The mainstream historical fact here is brutally simple. Most people existed in timber or wattle and daub huts, structures with so little insulation that the warmth inside rarely rose much above the bone-deep chill outside. Archaeological studies of early medieval houses across northern Europe confirm this, revealing floors of packed earth, walls that were perilously thin and wide, unforgiving gaps in the roof that seemed to invite winter winds inside, as if the house itself was daring you to complain. Comfort was a distant luxury, a concept only the very rich even pretended to grasp. Still, there were strategies. Your eyes catch a flicker of movement outside a curl of smoke from a neighbor's hearth ascending into the frigid air. It is the one hopeful sign that somewhere a fire has survived the night. Your own home has no chimney yet. That is an innovation for another time, another class. The hearth smoulders in the center of the single room, and the thick smoke clings to the rafters like a mournful ghost before reluctantly drifting out of a crude hole in the roof. You cough, a dry, racking sound, and your eyes sting with acrid tears. But you welcome that sting. You embrace it, because smoke means the fire hasn't gone out entirely. That smouldering, pathetic heap of embers, buried carefully under yesterday's ash, might just be coaxed back to life. If you blow gently, patiently, and feed it the driest twigs you can find, a flame might be born. But to lose it, to fail, that means facing hours of uncontrollable shivering, a deep, cellular cold, until you are forced to borrow a flame from a neighbor. Imagine the profound stress of warmth being not just a comfort, but a form of survival currency. There's a quirky tidbit here that often surprises people. To preserve these precious embers overnight, some households used specialized clay pots or lidded iron vessels, essentially medieval fire safes. The glowing coals would be banked with a thick layer of ash and sealed under heavy lids, starved of oxygen just enough so they could be revived at dawn. The modern image of people endlessly striking flint and steel in the frozen morning is deeply misleading. Fire was a precious, living thing, and you guarded it as jealously as you would a member of your own family. To lose your ember meant you'd be trudging half a mile through deep snow, a desperate pilgrim begging for a single live coal from someone else, carrying it home in a pot swaddled in wool like a newborn baby. As you shuffle toward the hearth, your breath pluming into visible ribbons in the gloom, You think of how historians still argue whether medieval winters were truly harsher than our own, or whether the so-called Little Ice Age exaggerated the misery. Some suggest the most brutal centuries came later, during the Renaissance, when even the River Thames froze solid. But anyone who has ever sat in a rough stone hut in the heart of January would argue that the academic debate hardly matters. The cold was devastating enough. You poke tentatively at the embers. Sparks leap in a sudden, defiant cascade, and for a fleeting, magical moment, you feel like a sorcerer. That faint glow is more valuable than any gold. A thin, tentative curl of warmth licks your frozen fingers. It's not enough to thaw you, not nearly, but it is enough to give hope. Your family begins to stir around you, the low groans of children. A loud, sharp sneeze from an older parent, and all eyes fix on you. Their gazes are a silent, desperate plea. Can you bring the fire back? In that small, smoky circle of responsibility, you feel the immense weight of generations who measured their mornings not in comfort, but in the simple, binary question of whether the ember held. Outside, the dawn is late and weak, a pale wash of grey. Snow crunches underfoot as the village slowly begins to stir. You see figures carrying bundles of sticks on their backs, others stumbling toward barns to feed animals that also shiver miserably in their stalls. A layer of frost whitens every thatched roof, turning the entire village into a silent, monochromatic sketch in chalk. You draw your wool tighter, realizing with a familiar resignation that today, like every single day of winter, will be a slow, grinding struggle against the freezing air. Yet, there is also a rhythm to this misery, a strange and intimate familiarity. You know instinctively how to tuck your feet beneath you when you sit, how to cradle your hands around a clay cup once the porridge is finally warm, how to angle your body toward the hearth, so that every precious inch of smoke-stained heat can kiss your skin. You know that this morning will feel eternal, but that eventually the sun will climb higher and the agonizing cold will dull into something merely grimly bearable. The smell of wood smoke fills your lungs again, acrid and sharp yet profoundly comforting. You lean in, your face close to the ash, coaxing a fragile flame from the ember. And for the first time today, you truly believe you might last another 24 hours in this frozen world. It is not luxury, it is not comfort, it is simply survival. One ember at a time. The glow builds, its orange tongues licking higher as the hearth begins to breathe again. You shuffle closer, stretching out your hands. But the heat is a territorial thing. It does not spread far. The hearth is not a modern, contained fireplace, but a crude pit dug into the earthen floor, or a simple circle of stones. Smoke writhes upward, not neatly, but like a restless, tormented spirit, refusing to leave until it has kissed every wooden beam and blackened every corner of the roof space. You blink through involuntary tears, your eyes watering, your lungs feeling raw. Yet you hold your ground, because this fragile flicker is not just fire. It is the absolute center of your world. The open hearth is everything at once: kitchen, heater, and potent social magnet. You recognize how your entire day, your family's entire existence, will circle back to this simple pit of flame. Here, bread is toasted on long iron pokers, stews bubble slowly for hours in cauldrons hanging from chains, and children dart too close, risking singed hair as their parents scold and pull them back with a sharp tug. In fact, a mainstream historical fact is that medieval households revolved, both physically and socially, around the hearth. It wasn't a decorative feature tucked neatly into a wall. It was planted right in the middle of the room, a benevolent tyrant demanding constant attention. But here's the quirky part. It wasn't just about warmth and food. The hearth fire was often seen as spiritually alive. People whispered charms over it as they lit it, crossed themselves, and sometimes placed protective herbs like rosemary or juniper in the flames. There are recorded traditions where a family would never let their fire die completely, because to do so was thought to be terrible luck, or worse, an omen of death. The fire was a household guardian as much as it was a furnace. Imagine going to bed each night knowing that if you slipped into carelessness, if the coals faded to black, you might have offended not just your shivering family but also some invisible, watchful power. And yet, Historians continue to puzzle over how truly effective these open hearths really were. Some argue that despite their central place, they gave off a pitiful amount of heat in the draughty, porous rooms of peasant cottages or even noble halls. Others counter that the psychological warmth mattered more, that the mere presence of light and a living glow softened the perception of cold, even when the actual air temperature barely shifted. It's one of those debates where numbers might not fully capture the feeling. You can measure heat output in units, but you cannot measure the profound comfort of flickering shadows on a long winter's night. As you sit by the fire now, your knees prickling with warmth, while a persistent draught chills your back, you notice how the hearth is also the village's rhythm keeper. A neighbor bursts in without knocking, stamping snow from her worn shoes, holding an empty pot. She begs a few embers to restart her own dead fire, and in exchange, she promises a share of her bread tomorrow. This exchange is not strange. It is the very fabric of daily life. Embers are borrowed like salt or flour, and the fire physically ties the whole community together. The smell of char, the sharp crackle of resin in pine wood, the faint sizzle when a damp log is tossed on all of it becomes the collective heartbeat of winter survival. And there is danger too. Constant, lurking danger. Sparks jump unexpectedly, landing on your coarse tunic. You slap at it quickly, your heart racing, realizing how easily a single moment's distraction could reduce your home and everything in it to ashes. Medieval villages burned often. One stray ember, one poorly tended flame, and half the settlement could vanish overnight in a terrifying inferno. The open hearth was no tame creature. It was warmth, yes, but it was also a wildness you had to respect and fear in equal measure. You think about how children must have grown up half-trained as fire watchers, learning from a young age how to feed it, bank it, and guard it. A household without a vigilant eye was always one step closer to disaster. And the smell of smoke in your clothes, your hair, your very skin, it never, ever left. You could walk through town and tell who had been tending their hearth by the faint, clinging aura of char that followed everyone. In a way, it was the perfume of survival. By midday, the hearth has settled into its steady rhythm, no longer roaring, but glowing with a deep, content heat. The embers are banked, so they will last until evening. The stew simmers, filling the air with a savory promise. Someone lays a pair of damp boots by the edge, hoping they'll be dry before tomorrow's frost. A dog curls on the floor, its belly turned to the heat, sighing deeply, as though it alone in this world knows true comfort. And you, half-smoked and half-thawed, realize that this one simple pit of fire is the thin, fragile line between life and death in a winter that offers nothing kindly. As shadows flicker up the soot-stained beams, you remember this is just the beginning. The hearth is not a luxury. It is the fragile flicker on which your entire existence precariously balances. Without it, you would not last the week. With it, you can at least sit and pretend, for a few precious hours, that warmth is possible in a world built mostly of cold. The air is thick now, not with warmth, but with the stubborn, choking haze that refuses to rise. You sit by the open blaze, your eyes watering, your throat coated with a gritty layer of soot, and you wonder if breathing in winter might kill you faster than freezing to death. The hearth roars in its shallow pit, but with no proper chimney, the smoke simply chooses its own meandering path up into the beams, curling lazily against the rafters, spreading across the room like a noxious fog until you can barely see your own fingers. The sensation is a constant paradox. You are alive because of this fire, and you are coughing your lungs out because of it too. The mainstream historical fact is stark. Before chimneys became common in the late medieval period, most homes relied on a simple smoke hole in the roof to guide the haze outside. But this guiding was a generous term. In reality, smoke drifted wherever it pleased, thickening the air so much that contemporary visitors often described houses as uninhabitable during cooking. The deeply blackened rafters of surviving medieval cottages and halls bear silent, powerful testimony. Archaeologists find centuries of tar and soot caked onto the wood like permanent, greasy shadows. Yet, there is something oddly practical about this choking atmosphere. Here's a quirky tidbit. Smoke, however irritating, helped preserve the timbers from wood, boring insects, acted as a crude disinfectant against airborne ailments. and even perfectly cured the hanging meats that villagers would string from the rafters. You cough and wheeze, but you also nibble on a piece of smoked bacon that owes its rich, savoury flavour to this very same accidental preservation. The air may be unbreathable, but your dinner directly benefits from the smouldering cloud. Still, historians debate how people tolerated such an environment. Some argue that medieval folk were simply used to it, their lungs having acclimated in ways we can no longer imagine. Others suggest that these intensely smoky houses were mainly a seasonal affliction, with fires blazing at full intensity only during the harshest winter months. There is no consensus, though, on whether these homes significantly shortened lifespans. You can almost picture the scholars, leaning forward over fragile manuscripts, disagreeing about whether the haze was a silent killer or merely a tolerable nuisance, while you, coughing on the earthen floor in this thought experiment, might like to settle the argument simply by pointing at your burning, inflamed eyes. Your nose runs, your head aches with a dull throb, and the fire crackles merrily, utterly indifferent to your discomfort. You crouch lower to the ground, angling your body toward what little direct warmth you can catch, even as you choke. The children, wise to this, hide beneath blankets, their eyes peeking out like small, soot-stained owls, their hair smelling perpetually of char. When guests arrive, you laugh awkwardly and wave your arms at the smoke, as if shooing away an unwanted, stubborn cat. The truth is, no medieval dwelling was free of it. Every house, every great hall, every bustling kitchen carried the same permanent haze. Sometimes, the smoke turns the room into a theatre of shadows. A rare beam of sunlight pierces through the roof hole, and shafts of light scatter like golden swords in the murky air. Dust motes dance with ash flakes, creating a surreal, almost holy beauty that nearly makes you forget the stench. You imagine sitting back, half suffocating but marvelling at the way light plays upon the smoke. For a moment, it feels like a sacred chapel with shafts of sun instead of stained glass. But the beauty always fades when your eyes begin to sting again. You tie a damp rag over your mouth and nose, something mothers teach their children when the haze grows too cruel. The rag does little, but it offers the illusion of protection. Your skin itches, and when you finally step outside, the freezing air feels like pure, shocking relief, crisp and clean, even though it freezes your lungs. You take deep, grateful gulps, grateful for the clarity. And yet you always return inside, because outside there is nothing but frost and a vast, unforgiving emptiness. And inside, at least, the hearth glows. You sit once more, coughing, but also thawing your fingers against the coals. The paradox becomes your normal. The smoke becomes a neighbour you never wanted, but have learned you must live with. Evenings are the worst. The fire is stoked high for cooking. The roof hole proves too small for the volume, and the room fills with hearty laughter and hacking coughs in equal measure. Someone sings a song, another ladles stew, a child sneezes, and all of you sit together in the dim, syrupy twilight of survival. You joke about the smoke, even as it makes your voice raspy, and you realize, in this medieval winter, the choice is not between comfort and discomfort. It is between breathing smoke and not breathing at all. The smoke hangs heavy, but the truest warmth doesn't come only from the fire. It comes from the people pressed close together around it, shoulders overlapping, breaths mingling in the dim, hazy light. You shift on the hard wooden bench, your knees brushing against another's, your blanket tugged tighter because half of it has been stolen by a sibling leaning too far into your space. Privacy is a word without meaning here. Survival is a collective contract. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Medieval families, particularly peasants, often slept together in a single room, huddled as one against the biting cold. Archaeological reconstructions of cottages show not separate bedrooms but one open communal space. Livestock goats, a pig, the family cow sometimes shared the same floor for the added warmth their bodies generated. The idea of a family bed is not a modern joke. It was a real, desperate defense against winter. And then there's the quirky detail that makes you chuckle despite the chill. Sometimes, entire communities practiced bundling, where travelers or guests would literally be invited to share a bed with strangers, just to keep everyone from freezing to death. Heavy boards or sacks stuffed with straw might be placed between bodies for a sliver of modesty, but the closeness was utterly non-negotiable. You didn't worry about awkward small talk. You worried about waking up alive. But scholars still disagree on the full extent of this shared intimacy. Some insist that peasants regularly slept with their animals indoors, goats, pigs, even chickens as a form of natural biological heating. Others argue that such claims are exaggerated by later writers, who were eager to depict medieval life as dirty and uncivilized. The truth may be muddled somewhere in between, and you, lying here with a calf chewing its cud just a few feet away, might sigh that the academic debate is missing the entire point. The beast's radiating warmth is undeniable, whether or not it's dignified. Your body sinks lower into the pile of coarse wool. The straw-stuffed mattress scratches at your legs through your tunic. You feel the constant, steady heat radiating from another's back pressed against yours. It's not comfortable. Someone snores with a deafening rattle. Another kicks violently in their sleep. But you cannot deny the way the cold seems less cruel, less absolute when it is shared. The air smells of sweat, smoke, and damp wool, a potent, familiar cocktail that is, in its own way, reassuring. There is a rhythm to this communal survival. At dusk, everyone piles in. The youngest tucked deepest into the nest of blankets, the eldest positioned near the fire for easy attending should it need fuel. In the dead of night, someone inevitably stirs to add a log to the embers, muttering curses at the cold before sliding back under the shared covering. You wake momentarily, disoriented in the tangle of limbs, then drift off again to the sound of steady breathing, the low murmur of animals shifting nearby, and the faint hiss of the fire settling deeper into its bed of ash. The thought crosses your mind. What happens when sickness strikes? You sneeze once, then twice, and you can almost imagine the contagion racing through the whole family bed by morning. But medieval people accepted this risk. The cold was the more immediate, more certain threat. So you turn your face into a wool sleeve and hope your cough is ignored. Yet, there is a profound tenderness in this closeness too. Children press their cold hands into their mother's warm sides. Fathers curl protectively around infants. Siblings share whispered jokes and stories long after the room has darkened. Warmth binds you, not only in temperature, but in deep, unspoken affection. Without fire, without insulation, without central heating, the human body itself becomes the last, most reliable furnace you can trust. You think back to last night, when the fire nearly died completely, and it was only the layered, huddled bodies that kept the frost from biting too deep. The memory sends a shiver through you now, not of cold, but of profound gratitude. The house may be filled with smoke, the walls may leak draughts like sieves, but as long as these bodies huddle together, you stand a chance against the longest, darkest nights. Somewhere in the darkness, the dog shifts, sighing, pushing its wet nose under a blanket edge. You smile at the sheer absurdity of it all, sharing not just warmth but dreams, with animals, children and adults, all tangled into one living, breathing bundle of survival. You close your eyes, knowing this arrangement isn't about comfort. It's about survival, plain and simple. And survival in a medieval winter is a victory worth every single cramped, smoky, sweaty inch. You wake with the familiar scratch of straw clinging to your hair, and an insidious draught crawling over your skin, a presence as thin and sharp as a knife's edge. The fire has gutted itself down again, leaving little more than a mound of grey ash that veils a dull, faintly pulsing red core. The room is hushed, the silence so profound that your own breath becomes an event, curling into pale, ghostly ribbons that hang for a suspended second before fading into the smoky gloom. You glance around your cottage, and the truth is painfully, unavoidably clear. The walls are no fortress. A mainstream historical fact sets the scene with brutal honesty. Most peasant cottages of the medieval period were built from wattle and daub, a fragile skeleton of thin wooden frames with pliable sticks like hazel or willow woven between them, then plastered with a crude mixture of mud, clay, and sometimes, crucially, cow dung. The roof above was a thick layer of thatch, the floor beneath, nothing more than tamped cold earth. Archaeologists studying the rare preserved examples in Britain and northern Europe note just how fragile these structures truly were, often lasting only a few decades before beginning to crumble back into the soil from which they were made. Against the drenching rains of summer, they worked well enough. But against the relentless assault of winter winds, they were little better than a sieve. You shift closer to the wall, and you can feel it. A penetrating damp seeps through the plaster, a clammy chill radiating outward, as though the night itself is pressing its icy fingers against you from the other side. You run your hand across the rough surface, and it crumbles slightly under your touch, releasing a faint, musty smell of earth and slow rot. There is insulation here, but only of the most basic, organic sort layers of animal dung mixed into the daub, serving as a crude but essential filler to keep the worst of the drafts at bay. It works, but only to a point. And here is the quirky tidbit. People often smeared a fresh layer of dung along the wall seams each autumn. This was a vital seasonal maintenance task, not unlike us fixing weather stripping around our doors. Imagine your household chore list reading: mend the roof, patch the wall, smear the dung. Children were sometimes set to this smelly but life-sustaining job, their tiny hands pressing handfuls of the odorous paste into the cracks. It was anything but glamorous, but in a world without fiberglass or double-glazed windows, cow dung was the medieval Home Depot. Yet scholars remain divided about just how miserable life in these cottages was during the coldest months. Some suggest that the sheer number of people packed inside, often entire families huddled with their livestock, created enough collective body heat to keep the worst of the frost away. Others argue that even with dung-sealed walls and a smoky hearth, the interior temperatures likely hovered just above freezing, leaving the inhabitants in a state of being permanently, deeply chilled. The truth, as is so often the case, likely resides in that grey space between extremes. A shelter just warm enough to permit survival, but always too cold to ever grant the solace of true comfort. You shuffle toward the embers, a cough catching in your throat as a cloud of ash rises to meet you. The very walls of the cottage creak and groan with the force of the wind, and through the thatch above, individual snowflakes sometimes drift down like silent, unwanted visitors. You brush one from your blanket, a feeling half of amusement, half of quiet despair. Outside, the fields lie silent and still under a hard frost. And inside, your cottage feels less like a shelter and more like a leaky, precarious box, barely holding back the vast, indifferent sky. Still, you make do. It is what your ancestors have always done. You patch the larger holes with scavenged rags. You hang old, threadbare cloaks over the widest gaps, and you stuff handfuls of dry straw into the seam where the wall meets the roof. It is never a perfect seal, but it takes the sharpest edge off the cold. Sometimes, families even plastered cured animal hides across the side of the house that faced the prevailing wind, turning the skins of last year's hunt into makeshift windbreaks. The gamey smell lingered, yes, but so did a little more precious warmth. As the day begins, you notice the subtle patterns carved into your daily rhythm by these inadequate walls. You find yourself working harder when near the hearth, lingering longer in the shared bed, and instinctively avoiding the corners where the frost creeps in with its icy tendrils. The room is not an evenly warm space. It has its own microclimates, hot and smoky by the fire, bitingly icy at the walls, and merely tolerable in the middle. You adapt to it instinctively, your body learning without conscious thought where to sit, where to sleep, where to avoid. The sound of a slow, rhythmic dripping starts as a patch of snow on the roof finally melts through the thatch. You mutter a quiet curse and place a clay pot beneath it, realizing that your cottage is always engaged in a constant, losing argument with the elements. And though the elements almost always win, you keep patching, mending, and surviving. When you finally step outside into the blinding white of the snow, a dry laugh almost escapes your lips. The cottage, for all its flaws, looks like it belongs here. Its thatched roof is as white as the ground, its muddy walls blending seamlessly with the frozen earth. It is flimsy, yes, but it is also an integral part of the landscape, a home literally shaped from mud and dung, at once fragile and profoundly stubborn. You know you will curse its incessant drafts again tonight, but for now, in the pale morning light, you nod at it with a feeling of deep, grudging respect. After all, it still stands, and so do you. The wind howls across the open fields. its voice a mournful song against rattling shutters. But when you step from that world into the nobleman's hall, you are struck first not by silence or by grandeur, but by sheer, breathtaking size. The ceiling soars high above you into a cathedral of shadow, its massive beams blackened by centuries of soot. Banners, heavy with the dust of ages, stir faintly in the ever-present draught. And there, at the center of this cavernous space, a fire roars with an arrogant confidence no peasant could ever dream of. Logs as thick as your arm are piled one upon another in a pyre of wealth, flames leaping eagerly toward the rafters, their sparks snapping like a swarm of restless, fiery insects. For a moment, it feels like stepping into another, warmer world. But the truth of this place reveals itself quickly enough. The mainstream historical fact is simple. The medieval Great Hall, the very heart of a lord's household, was built for gathering, for feasting, and for asserting indisputable authority. The hearth was often enormous, placed centrally on the stone floor, or in later periods, shifted toward a wall with a great hood to guide some of the smoke. These fires consumed staggering amounts of wood each day, sometimes entire cartloads, a spectacle that reflected both the lord's immense wealth and the sheer, maddening impracticality of heating such cavernous spaces. Records show that noble households employed whole teams of servants, tasked with the unending cycle of cutting, hauling, and feeding the fire, a continuous procession to serve a hungry, wooden god. But here comes the quirky, almost cruel tidbit. Despite its magnificent size, the fire barely warmed the hall. Accounts from the period are rife with complaints from visitors who described roasting on the side of their body, facing the flames, while their backs remained frozen solid. The nobility, in their wisdom, sat on raised platforms at one end, closer to the blaze, while servants, retainers, and lesser guests shivered further down the long room. The illusion of warmth, it seems, mattered far more than its reality. A roaring fire made a powerful statement. Here lives someone powerful enough to burn an entire forest in a single winter. Historians still debate whether these great halls were primarily functional heating systems or overwhelmingly symbolic displays of wealth and dominance. Some argue they were simply impractical as living spaces in winter, better suited to grand ceremonies and banquets than to daily comfort. Others counter that the social warmth, the music, the company, the boisterous feasts offset the physical chill, making the hall livable in its own vibrant way. Standing here, with your cheeks scorched and your spine shivering, you suspect the argument is not academic at all, but entirely physically real. You shuffle closer, edging into the precious ring of heat, while behind you the vast hall echoes with the sounds of discomfort coughs and muted mutters. Servants scurry past carrying more wood, their faces ruddy from the smoke, their eyes narrowed against the constant drift of stinging sparks. Dogs, clever enough to understand the hall's geography of comfort, sprawl near the very edge of the hearth, claiming the best spots for themselves. Somewhere high above, the smoke swirls into the blackened rafters before slinking lazily toward distant roof vents. But most of it still hangs thick in the air, a permanent haze that leaves your own cloak heavy with its scent before long. The sound of the fire fills the hall, a constant, crackling undertone beneath the hum of conversations. You imagine the lord at his high table, his form bathed in flickering orange light, his silver goblet gleaming as he gestures grandly. Behind him, magnificent tapestries flutter in the draught, their woven scenes of hunt and battle serving as more decorative than insulating, though they do manage to dull the worst of the chill bleeding from the stone. The servants bring trenchers piled high with steaming meat, the rich smell mingling with the ever-present wood smoke until hunger finally overtakes your discomfort. Still, you cannot ignore the central contradiction. This is grandeur at its most impractical. The blaze devours wood with a greedy, insatiable appetite, yet the hall remains stubbornly cold. You watch as guests tug their cloaks tighter, shift their chairs an inch closer, or hover near the flames when they believe no one of importance is watching. The poor soul, freezing outside in the village, might dream of such a fire, but the reality is far less comfortable than it seems. You watch as the logs collapse inward, sending a brilliant shower of sparks shooting high. A young boy darts forward with a fresh armload of wood, nearly tumbling into the fiery pit as he feeds the blaze. He grins, a flash of white teeth in a soot-stained face, undeterred by the danger. For a servant, warmth is a fleeting, stolen pleasure, so you enjoy it while you can. The hall hums with life, but the cold seeps back quickly into the corners and shadows. A constant, silent reminder that stone, no matter how richly decorated, is a poor companion in the dead of winter. As the night deepens, music begins, and the hall becomes alive with laughter, ale, and song. Yet even here, amidst the revelry, noblemen pull their fur-lined cloaks tighter, shifting ever closer to the hearth. The fire roars, the smoke curls, the banners stir, and still you shiver. Wealth may buy spectacle, but it does not always buy comfort. The banners in the noble hall sway as the fire spits, but your eyes are drawn from the flames to the walls themselves. They stretch upward, vast, imposing stone surfaces that catch the glow of the fire, yet seem to swallow it whole, leaving the corners of the hall dim and profoundly cold. A deep chill seeps from those stones, as if they have hoarded the winter inside their very bulk and are now slowly breathing it back out into the room. You tug your cloak tighter, and then you notice something truly remarkable. Hangings of fabric, long, magnificent swaths of woven threads, depicting epic hunts, pious saints, and intricate floral patterns. They ripple faintly in the draught, but they change the entire atmosphere in a way that bare stone never could. One well-documented reality of this era is that nobles invested heavily in tapestries and other textile wall hangings, not only as a conspicuous display of wealth, but as a practical form of insulation. Contemporary records describe how these heavy fabrics were hung across the cold stone surfaces to reduce the biting, radiating chill. They acted like a form of medieval wallpaper, portable, colourful, and surprisingly effective. When nobles travelled between their various castles, the tapestries often went with them, rolled carefully and loaded into wagons, ensuring that no hall was left cold and barren for long. Oddly enough, these textiles sometimes carried more than just warmth. Imagine a single tapestry serving as both insulation and a storytelling device, a vast woven canvas displaying the family's genealogy, powerful religious imagery, or even bold political propaganda. Guests would sit and stare, their eyes drawn not just to the flickering firelight, but to a constant, visual reminder of their host's power and lineage. And here's a curious little twist. There are accounts of some noble households hanging entire painted cloths, smeared with wax to repel dampness, turning their walls into a functional patchwork of protection and prestige. Yet, experts remain divided on just how effective these wall hangings truly were against the cold. Some argue that even the thickest wool or linen, with padded backings, could do little more than dull the worst drafts seeping through the porous stone. Others insist that in a time when any layer mattered, the psychological comfort of a richly decorated and slightly less icy wall was worth every coin spent. The disagreement continues because the physical evidence surviving fragments of cloth, detailed records of inventories, gives us only hints, not the full, sensory reality of sitting in a drafty castle during the heart of January. You walk closer, your fingertips brushing the edge of one hanging. The surface is rough, the threads slightly greasy, with the natural lanolin of the wool, and the smell is faintly earthy. You imagine the servants climbing tall ladders to fix these heavy panels in place, how they would shake them out in the summer and beat the accumulated dust from them in the autumn, preparing for another long cycle of winter defense. They are both ornament and armor, softening a hall that would otherwise echo with the cold hardness of stone and smoke. The hall feels transformed in the spaces where the fabric hangs. Instead of a cavern, it becomes a chamber. The shadows seem warmer, the colors glow richly in the firelight, and the damp stone no longer chills quite as sharply. A dog shifts closer to the wall, curling up happily in a spot where the draft has been noticeably dulled. You realize that creating warmth in the medieval world was never a single trick. It was a strategy of layering, fire, bodies, fabrics, and stones, all working together, imperfectly but persistently. The servants bustle in, adjusting a hanging that has sagged. You picture the immense labor behind it. The spinners, the weavers, the dyers, all collaborating to create this single piece. Every thread was touched by a human hand, Every pattern was intentional. In a world where nothing came cheap, a tapestry was not just decoration, it was survival art. Families might even sit with their backs pressed against it at night, letting its thick fibers absorb some of the room's pervasive chill, never mind the noble symbolism stitched across its face. You move to a corner without a hanging, and the difference is instantaneous and brutal. The stone radiates cold like a block of ice. Your skin prickles, and your breath condenses in a quick, thick fog. You find yourself instinctively stepping back toward the perceived warmth of the fabric. It dawns on you that medieval people understood this intimately, not as a theory, but as a daily, physical truth. You don't need to measure insulation value in numbers. You simply feel it in your bones. Of course, the hangings could only do so much. In a deep frost, the hall still felt cavernous. Drafts still slipped beneath doorways, and true warmth still pulled only within the immediate reach of the hearth. But think about how human imagination fills the gaps, how a richly colored wall transforms your entire sense of space. You are not only less cold, you believe yourself to be less cold, and that belief alone might be what keeps you going through the bitterest months. Later in the evening, guests arrive for a feast. They stare at the gleaming hangings, remark on their beauty, and whisper amongst themselves about the staggering cost. The host smiles, knowing he has impressed them not just with his fire and food, but with walls that tell stories. Walls that keep out more than just the frost. They keep out the impression of poverty. You sit back and consider how warmth in this world is never simply physical. It is also symbolic, psychological, and social. To hang a tapestry is to declare that you care about comfort, culture, and status, all at once. The cold is relentless, but so is the human instinct to fight it with beauty as well as with practicality. As the night wanes, you lean against the heavy fabric, your head resting where a deer is woven in mid-leap. The fire snaps, the hall buzzes with life, and for once, you don't feel the stones gnawing at your spine. Instead, you feel cocooned in color, sound, and a fragile, created warmth. A fragile victory, yes, but a victory nonetheless, stitched carefully into woolen threads that will outlast the winter. The hall slowly quiets. The great fire collapses into a bed of glowing coals, and yet the cold creeps in again, always searching for weaknesses. Your gaze drifts upward toward the windows, those dark, gaping holes in the wall that seem more like invitations for frost than barriers against it. You wrap your arms tighter around yourself, knowing instinctively that medieval windows were rarely allies in the great battle against winter. One well-preserved fact from this period is that most windows, even in wealthier households, were little more than unglazed openings. They were sometimes covered with rough wooden shutters, sometimes patched with scraps of cloth or thin, stretched leather. In more affluent homes, oiled parchment was stretched taut across wooden frames to admit a muted golden glow while blocking some of the drafts. Glass existed, yes, but it was staggeringly expensive, a luxury reserved for churches, monasteries, and the most opulent of castles. Even then, it was often wavy, bubbled, and pieced together in small, diamond-shaped panels held by lead canes, rather than the clear, seamless panes you know today. And here's a curious little twist. Even when a lord could afford glass, he often chose coloured pieces for their sheer beauty. Imagine trying to enjoy what little winter sunlight there was through a window that glowed a deep green or a rich amber, pretty, but hardly practical. The coloured glass dazzled visitors, a clear sign of wealth, but it left the inhabitants squinting in the dim light and still shivering against the persistent drafts that seeped in around the lead frames. Wealth, once again, was making a statement, but not necessarily one of warmth. Researchers remain divided over just how much protection these parchment or horn windows truly offered. Some argue that the thin, translucent materials filtered the light, but did precious little against the biting cold. Others counter that even the faintest of barriers slowed the winds enough to matter in a world of constant drafts. The evidence is tricky. Few medieval homes survive perfectly intact, and written documents often focus more on taxes and property rights than on the mundane details of daily window coverings. Standing here, your own fingers growing numb from the draft, you're inclined to side with the skeptics. Parchment might mute the gale, but it doesn't stop you from shivering. You step closer to one window, pushing against the heavy wooden shutter. It creaks and rattles on its iron hinges, its surface rough and splintered with age. A sudden, violent blast of icy air rushes through the gap, and you slam it back shut, your heart thumping. The shutter doesn't seal. It never does. Cold, invisible fingers reach through the cracks, a constant reminder that winter doesn't need an invitation. It seeps in wherever it finds the smallest space. You stuff a rag into the joint, a desperate, hopeful act, but deep down, you know it's a losing battle. Daylight through these openings is weak and filtered, more gloom than glow. You imagine waking each morning to a room so dim you could mistake it for twilight, squinting as you poke the hearth awake, stumbling as you grope for your tools. Sunlight never floods a medieval space. It dribbles in, reluctantly, bouncing off the smoke and soot until the interior feels more like a cave than a chamber. And when night falls, the shutters slam shut, leaving you entirely at the mercy of the flickering firelight and dim rush lamps. Yet, there is resilience here, too. Families learned clever tricks. Some draped spare cloth or even old cloaks across the windows, layering protection against the cold. Others angled their shutters inward, adding thickness, or plastered the edges with clay for the duration of the season. In towns, people learned to build their homes close together, leaning against the walls of their neighbors, so that fewer sides were exposed directly to the wind. Every small adjustment mattered. The sound of the wind outside grows louder, rattling through the gaps like an angry, uninvited guest. You imagine the snow piling up against the outer wall, drifting against the shutters, frosting their wooden edges white. You touch the surface, and it feels icy cold, a stark reminder that you live not securely behind walls and glass, but in a constant, delicate negotiation with the elements. Survival here is improvisation, and yet there's something oddly beautiful in it too. On bright, clear mornings, the weak sunlight catches the oiled parchment, making it glow like a slab of pure amber. You can squint and see the dark shadows of passing figures outside villages, bent beneath heavy loads of wood, children trailing behind them, dogs bounding joyfully in the fresh snow. The window is imperfect, but it is a lens to the world, a precious reminder that even in the depths of winter, life continues just beyond the walls. By evening, though, you curse it again. Drafts snake across the floor, extinguishing candles, chilling your bare toes. You pull closer to the fire, muttering about shutters that will never, ever stay shut, and you wonder if true comfort is even possible in such a house. But then you remind yourself, people endured this not for mere days, but for generations. They patched, they layered, and they adapted, not because they had perfect solutions, but because imperfect ones were all they needed to survive. The window rattles once more, the sound of a groaning hinge echoing in the dimness. You sigh, and a faint smile touches your lips. This is the sound of winter, a song sung not by snow or frost, but by wood, cloth, and parchment, all fighting to hold back the night. And you, sitting in your cloak by the fire, you are part of that same battle. One more human figure, hunched against a draft that never quite ends. The window rattles again, a persistent, skeletal percussion against the silence. But you turn away from it, because the true refuge of winter, the final sanctuary against the night, waits in the corner of the room, the bed. This is not a single soft mattress with springs and pristine sheets the way you might imagine. It is a makeshift nest, a humble mound of straw stuffed into a coarse sack, which is then layered with worn linen, heavy wool, and whatever precious scraps of fur you can gather. It is a humble, uninviting pile, yet the moment you crawl inside, a profound truth is revealed. This bundle of fabric and straw is not merely bedding, it is a meticulously engineered machine, a miniature furnace designed for one purpose: to capture every precious bit of heat your own body produces. Contemporary accounts and household records confirm that bedding was the medieval person's most reliable and intimate shield against the cold of the night. The poor made do with simple straw pallets laid directly on the earthen floor, often shared by several members of a household in a tangle of limbs. The wealthier, by contrast, layered feather beds, thick coverlets, and luxurious fur throws until the sleeper was all but buried under a small, soft mountain of textiles. Archaeological finds even suggest that beds in more affluent homes were sometimes boxed in with heavy wood panels or thick curtains, creating a self-contained pocket of warmth where your own breath would hang heavy in the air, but the frost dared not settle. Oddly enough, one of the more eccentric customs, born of pure necessity, was the use of hay or even dried seaweed as a mattress filler in coastal villages. People stuffed whatever insulating material they had on hand into large sacks, replacing the contents periodically when they became too musty or compressed. The bed wasn't meant to be plush or luxurious. It was meant to insulate. Imagine curling up on a crinkling, rustling mattress of dried reeds, less a cozy cloud, more a living, breathing nest. Yet in the dead of winter, that constant rustling sound was deeply reassuring. It was audible proof that you had something, anything, between your body and the frozen floor. Specialists continue to puzzle over how much genuine privacy or comfort these sleeping arrangements truly allowed. Some argue that the heavy bed curtains found in wealthier homes were as much about trapping warmth as they were about creating a space for intimacy in a crowded world. Others suggest they doubled as potent status symbols, richly embroidered and dyed, to show off wealth in an era where fine fabric was often more precious than coin. Still, whether for warmth, privacy, or simple bragging rights, the enclosed bed became one of the defining features of medieval domestic life. You climb into the bedding now, feeling the immediate, sharp scratch of straw beneath the first thin layer of wool. It pricks at your skin through your linen shift, a minor but constant irritation. But once you shift around, the straw compresses, molding itself slightly to the shape of your body. The blanket above is heavy, pressing down with a solid, reassuring weight. You carefully tuck the edges beneath your body, sealing yourself into a personal cocoon. Within minutes, a small miracle occurs. The warmth of your own breath begins to build, creating a pocket of humid, livable air. It is profoundly dark inside the drawn bed curtains, the distant firelight reduced to a faint ethereal glow filtering through the coarse fabric. You can still hear the sounds of the house settling for the night, the groaning creak of wood, the dog shifting restlessly on the floor, the faint, high-pitched whistle of the wind as it sneaks through the shutters. But in here, within your nest, the world feels muted, distant. Even the most bitter and invasive drafts seem to hesitate at the edge of the fabric, finally defeated by the simple, layered power of wool, fur, and tightly drawn cloth. There are risks, of course. There are always risks where fire is concerned. A stray coal or a glowing ember slipping from the hearth and landing too near could set the dry straw bedding ablaze in an instant. Stories circulated in hushed tones of careless sleepers waking to the terrifying smell of smouldering straw, scrambling in the dark to beat out the sparks before they could spread and consume the entire home. The smell of smoke might mean warmth out in the hall, but in the close confines of the bed, it meant pure terror. Parents would constantly warn their children never to drag embers too close for a bit of extra heat, though sometimes, desperate for any warmth, someone would risk it anyway. Yet despite these ever-present dangers, the bed was where families found not just warmth, but a deep and abiding comfort. Children nestled against their parents, drawing heat and security from their bodies. Siblings shared furs, their legs entwined. Couples whispered quietly in the darkness, their secrets held safe by the heavy curtains. The intimacy was forced by necessity, a byproduct of the cold, but it also forged unbreakable bonds. You imagine lying here shoulder to shoulder, your breath mingling with that of others, the bed curtains holding back not only the drafts, but also the profound loneliness of a long, dark night. And when you finally close your eyes, the effect is magical. The world outside the bed may be frozen solid, but inside your little furnace of fabric, time itself seems to soften. Dreams float easily in the warm, still air of this cocoon. Perhaps that is why medieval people so often described sleep as blessed, even sacred. It was the one time the cold could not chase you, the one time your body could truly rest. Morning will come, inevitably, with its stiff joints and the feeling of straw stuck in your hair. You'll sneeze at the dust, shake out the heavy covers, and groan at the shocking wave of cold that floods in the moment you leave your sanctuary. But tonight, at least, you understand how a simple sack of straw and a pile of ragged blankets could become the single most treasured technology of winter survival. The straw beneath you still rustles as you rise, and your joints ache with the particular stiffness of sleeping in one curled position for too long. The fire has burned low again, reduced to nothing but grey ash veiling a faint, almost invisible glow. You grope in the gloom for something to bring comfort before you dare face the full chill of the room. And then you remember the household trick, a simple piece of wisdom passed down through generations. Hot stones and warming pans. Evidence from medieval household records makes it clear that people often relied on heated objects to carry a piece of the hearth's warmth into their beds. Smooth river stones were baked in the embers, or set near the hearth, until they radiated a deep, penetrating heat, then wrapped carefully in layers of cloth to prevent burns before being slipped between the cold covers. In wealthier homes, metal warming pans, long-handled brass or copper containers filled with hot coals were slid under the blankets and moved back and forth like a slow, deliberate iron to chase away the damp, bone-deep chill. The heat they provided did not last long, but for those first few heavenly moments as you climbed into bed, the relief was absolute. Surprisingly, some households went even further with this practice. There are accounts of bricks, clay tiles, and even heavy iron tools being heated for use as makeshift warmers. In some cases, farmers would occasionally place small, covered pots of embers near their feet, relying on their gentle glow to carry them into sleep. In the coldest regions, it was not unusual to find families keeping their warmed stones wrapped and bundled all night, pulling them into the bed as if they were cherished, silent pets. Imagine hugging a carefully bundled rock, grateful not for its companionship, but for the lingering, stubborn heat it so generously held. Not all scholars agree on how widespread warming pans were outside of noble homes. Some argue that the metal required to craft them was far too costly for peasants, who likely stuck to scavenged stones and discarded tiles. Others suggest that simpler, wooden-handled pans filled with hot sand might have been accessible to the better-off among the villagers. The lack of consistent archaeological evidence keeps the debate alive, though it hardly matters when you place a hot stone at your own feet and sigh in pure, unadulterated delight. You reach toward the hearth now, carefully fishing a flat, smooth stone from the edges of the ashes. It's glowing faintly, far too hot to touch directly. You wrap it quickly and expertly in a piece of spare cloth and cradle it gingerly, the wonderful warmth seeping into your stiff, numb fingers. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine that this one humble rock is a sun, small but powerful, offering just enough heat to keep the frost at bay. You tuck it deep into the bedding and watch as steam rises faintly from the damp cloth as the chill flees. The air suddenly smells of scorched fabric, a sharp and acrid scent. You grimace, knowing the ever-present danger. If the stone is too hot, it might singe or even ignite the dry straw of the bedding. Families learned caution from an early age. Children were warned never to touch the hot metal pan when it slid beneath the sheets, lest their hands blister instantly. Stories circulated of careless servants who left hot coals, unattended for too long, and woke to find their master's mattresses smouldering. In winter, fire was both savior and threat, and nowhere was that delicate balance more intimate than in your own bed. As the stone gradually cools, you curl your toes around it, savoring the fading warmth. The sensation spreads slowly up through your legs, a feeling like a distant memory of summer. You know it will not last. Within an hour, the stone will be cold again, its magic gone, indistinguishable from the frozen floor. But that brief reprieve is enough to soothe you into sleep, enough to ease the persistent ache of endless drafts. You think of how many countless nights in history were softened by such simple, clever tricks. How many people whispered their thanks to a stone, a tile, or a pan of hot coals? How many nights might have been unbearable without this small, ingenious invention? It is humbling, in a way, to realize that survival sometimes depends not on grand feasts or mighty castles, but on a single rock pulled from the fire and swaddled like a child. The fire sputters again, the embers sighing as they settle, and you know another stone could be heated soon. Tonight, you will sleep not in luxury, but in a compromise, shivering a little less because you have carried a precious fragment of the hearth with you into the dark. And when dawn arrives, cold and pale, you will rise with stiff limbs, shake out the bedding, and prepare once more for the nightly ritual of coaxing a little warmth into the bed. It is a fragile, repetitive routine, but it works. The winter outside rages on, uncaring. But inside your little corner of the world, a stone, a cloth, and a bit of ingenuity mean the difference between despair and endurance. The glow of your stone fades completely into darkness, leaving you once more at the mercy of the hearth. But the fire, though essential, was never the only flame in a medieval household. You noticed the small, brave flickers scattered across the room, tallow candles set into rough wooden holders, thin rushlights leaning in clay pots, stubby tapers dripping wax onto the floor. Their glow is frail, almost pathetic, compared to the roaring hearth. But when the main fire dies low, these lesser flames take on a quiet dignity of their own. It's well documented in household accounts that medieval lighting came from three main sources: candles, rushlights, and oil lamps. Candles, made from either tallow or beeswax, also doubled as miniature heat givers in tiny spaces, though their warmth was weak at best. Beeswax was highly prized for burning bright with less smoke, but it was far too costly for common peasants. Most villagers relied on tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, which sputtered, smoked, and left the house smelling faintly, unpleasantly rancid. Still, in a world of deep, profound winter darkness, even the stink of tallow was worth the light it provided. And here's an eccentric detail. Rushlights were among the most common and ingenious household inventions. Villagers would soak the soft pith of rush plants in leftover animal fat, and then set them alight, creating long, thin tapers that burned with an uneven, flickering glow. They were cheap, accessible, and eminently practical, but they dripped hot ash everywhere and filled the air with a sour, greasy scent. Some households grew rushes in nearby marshland, specifically for this purpose, harvesting and drying them in the autumn to prepare for the long, dark months ahead. Imagine the sound of them crackling faintly, their glow jittering like a swarm of nervous fireflies in the oppressive gloom. Not all historians agree on how much heat these small lights actually contributed. Some suggest they added negligible warmth, their primary purpose being visibility. Others counter that in tightly enclosed corners, say, within the confines of bed curtains or in tiny nooks, these little flames offered just enough ambient heat to take the sharp sting off the frost. The lack of precise measurements leaves the debate unresolved. But anyone who has ever cupped frozen hands around a candle knows the deep, psychological comfort of even the smallest flame. You reach for one now, pinching the soft tallow base to adjust it upright in its holder. The fat sputters, sending a greasy, smoky curl into the air, and your fingers now smell faintly of rendered fat. The light is dim, but you lean closer, grateful for the tiny circle of warm glow it throws across the table. For a moment, you can see clearly enough to mend a sock, scratch a quick note, or simply watch the shadows dance and leap on the wall. The flame pops suddenly, a tiny explosion of fat, making you flinch proof that even this humble source of light and warmth has its own little temper. These flames were fragile companions. One strong gust of draught, one careless elbow, and they winked out, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. Children learned quickly to shield them with their bodies when a door opened, crouching like small guardians around these fragile, precious stars. A candle wasn't just a convenience, it was a responsibility. You feel that weight now as you shield the fragile rushlight with your palm, watching the shadows grow long and distorted on the wall. And yet, for all their inherent weakness, these lights change the atmosphere completely. The room seems less empty with their constant flicker, less hostile. The cold remains, yes, creeping at your feet, but your eyes rest easier when the darkness is not absolute. Medieval nights were long, far longer than you may imagine, stretching endlessly from the dusk of late afternoon to the late light of morning. Without these flames, the nights would have felt unbearable. With them, they became survivable, and even, at times, strangely beautiful. There is a soft, quiet romance in the way the different flames dance together. The hearth glows low and red, but the candles wink with a yellow light. The rushlights flicker erratically, and the shadows they cast ripple across the woven hangings on the wall. You hear a child murmur in their sleep, shifting beneath a pile of blankets, their small face bathed faintly in the gentle glow. You imagine couples whispering by candlelight, monks copying sacred texts by rushlight, guards warming their frozen hands over a shielded lantern during the long night watch. The flame is not just heat or light, it is companionship against the vast, indifferent cold. Of course, danger was always nearby. A tallow candle toppled too close to the dry thatch of the roof could mean utter disaster. Fire was both savior and predator, always waiting for an opportunity to slip out of control. You picture a village night when one careless rushlight spilled its burning fat into a pile of straw, and an entire row of cottages vanished in a cloud of smoke and flame. Every flame, no matter how small, was treated with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. You cradle it, but you also fear it, knowing that it holds both hope and ruin in its tiny, dancing heart. Still, you blow gently across your candle, not to extinguish it, but just to watch the flame bend and flare in the current of your breath. The warmth on your skin is faint, barely perceptible, but in this dark, frozen room, even that whisper of heat feels like a friend's reassuring hand on your shoulder. And you realize that medieval life was built on the cumulative courage of these small, individual flames, each one too weak to survive alone, but together they formed a constellation of survival in the endless night. The little flames of the rushlights sputter, their meager fuel of grease and fat finally fading, until once again the great hearth becomes your main companion. But not every medieval winter night was spent huddled within a smoky cottage or a cavernous, draughty hall. Picture yourself now, walking in disciplined silence through cloistered stone corridors, the rhythmic scrape of leather sandals on frozen flagstones the only sound. Your own breath curls before you like incense in the deep, hallowed dark of a world apart. You are in a monastery now, a place where warmth is rationed with such care it is treated almost like a sacrament. The austere doctrines from monastic rules, especially those of the Benedictines, make it plain that fire was not a comfort for every room. Monks rose long before the dawn, filing into icy, unheated chapels to chant their prayers, their freezing hands tucked deep into the opposing sleeves of their habits. The cloister corridors themselves were deliberately left unheated, an architectural choice designed to harden the spirit against the weaknesses of the flesh. Only the kitchen, the infirmary for the sick, and sometimes the refectory were granted a dependable fire, leaving the monks to endure the profound, penetrating cold in contemplative silence. Accounts from medieval visitors describe seeing the monks' ink freezing solid in their inkwells, their very breath hanging in crystalline clouds over precious manuscripts as they copied holy texts by hand. Here is a surprising glimpse into that world of pious frost. In some monasteries, a communal warming room, known as the calefactory, became a treasured, almost mythical refuge. It was often the only place within the entire complex with a steady, legitimate blaze, and the brothers were permitted to gather there for brief, scheduled moments of relief. Imagine 24 men, their forms nearly identical in their dark, woolen habits, shivering as one body as they crowd desperately close to the fire, their hands outstretched, faces etched with a mixture of pain and gratitude. They are trying to absorb enough radiant heat to carry back with them, like a spiritual ember, into the frozen silence of their cells. In some regions, these calefactories became quiet social hubs, where whispered conversations and shared stories thawed more than just their limbs. There is still disagreement among scholars over how strictly such rigid rules were enforced. Some argue that ascetic orders genuinely forbade any fire in the dormitories, forcing monks to survive the brutal nights in unheated stone cells through sheer force of will. Others suggest that local practices varied widely, with more pragmatic abbots permitting the use of braziers during especially harsh winters. The written rules may have been stern, but the human instinct for survival often bent these rigid doctrines. We may never know the full consistency of the practice, though standing here, your own bare feet growing numb against the icy floors, you suspect the stricter interpretations were very real indeed. You follow the silent line of monks now as they file into the refectory for their meager meal. The hall is austere, its stone walls bare, but at its center a fire burns, modest but steady. The familiar smell of wood smoke mingles with the scent of coarse bread and simple pottage. The monks eat in complete silence, while a designated reader chants scripture from a lectern, their bowls of stew steaming faintly in the chill. The fire does not warm the whole expansive room, not even close, but its mere presence makes the meal tolerable. Without it, the simple act of eating would feel like a punishment. With it, a fragile sense of community is sustained through the worst of the winter months. Later, you wander into the scriptorium, where the scribes sit hunched at long wooden desks. There is no hearth here, only a few tallow candles sputtering against the encroaching gloom. The men bend low over the pages, their knuckles white with cold, their fingers stiff, their ink growing thick and sluggish. Some wear fingerless gloves, crafted from rough wool. Others simply breathe on their hands, a small, futile ritual before continuing their painstaking work. The air is filled only with the sound of quills scratching on parchment, a rhythm that remains steady and deliberate despite the biting cold. The magnificent manuscripts that survive from this era are testaments, not just to piety and patience, but to sheer physical endurance words and glorious illuminations carved into vellum by men who were half frozen at their desks. In the cloister walkways, a creeping frost paints the stones, which glitter faintly in the flickering torchlight. The grand arches are open to the elements, and the wind sweeps through without mercy. You pull your heavy habit tighter, your shoulders hunched against the assault, and you wonder how many winters a man could possibly withstand in this way. Yet for the monks, the cold was more than a mere challenge. It was a form of discipline. To endure it was to share in the suffering of Christ, to let the body weaken so that the spirit could grow strong and unburdened. Still, you can't help but smile at the thought of those same monks sneaking a few extra, stolen moments in the calefactory, warming their numb hands just before the bell summoned them away to prayer or work. You can picture the quiet, profound relief on their faces, the subtle sigh of pleasure as the feeling of blood returned to their white fingers. These small, stolen comforts, this tiny rebellion, were as human as the solemn prayers they recited. Night falls, and the dormitory is a void of blackness and silence. Rows of narrow, simple beds stretch into the shadows. No fire, no candle, only the sound of human breath, rising like a pale, ghostly mist in the absolute cold. You climb under thin, coarse blankets, feeling the chill of the stones seep relentlessly upward through the thin straw mattress. All around you, men shift in the darkness, their quiet coughs echoing sharply against the hard stone walls. The discipline is undeniably harsh, but in it, there is also a strange and profound serenity, an acceptance of winter as an integral part of their spiritual life. Your body shivers, your teeth begin to chatter, but your heart beats steadily in your chest. You realize that warmth here is not measured by temperature alone. It is found in the deep, resonant rhythm of prayer, in the fellowship of shared voices chanting together in the cold, in the unshakable conviction that enduring such hardship brings one closer to God. For the monks, mere survival was never the only goal. To shiver was to serve. To suffer was to sanctify. And so, in this monastery cloaked in frost, you drift into an uneasy sleep, warmed not by fire, but by faith, and by the quiet, unyielding strength of men who believed that the cold itself was a teacher. The monastery bells still echo faintly in your ears as you step back into the rhythm of village life, a world where not every place was resigned to the discipline of an icy silence. Picture, if you will, the steam rising in thick, fragrant curls, swirling against dark rafters until the entire room glows with a spectral, humid light. You are standing in a bathhouse, a rare but deeply cherished escape from the endless, gnawing freeze. Written accounts from medieval towns and bustling cities confirm that public bathhouses dotted the landscape of Europe, from the crowded lanes of London to the quiet streets of small German villages. They were far more than just places to wash. They were warm, living sanctuaries. The baths themselves were heated by roaring furnaces or large, dedicated hearths, and the great vats of water retained enough heat to fill the enclosed air with a thick, enveloping steam. Patrons lingered here for hours, soaking in deep wooden tubs, gossiping, conducting business, and sometimes even eating and drinking while the snow piled high in the world just outside their door. For people accustomed to the constant discomfort of smoky cottages and the vast, freezing halls of the nobility, these steamy, vibrant rooms must have felt like stepping into paradise itself. An unusual detail, preserved in the records of cities like Paris and Nuremberg, reveals that bathhouses often blurred the line between public bath and public house. They frequently doubled as taverns or even exclusive social clubs. For a price, you might sip on spiced wine while reclining in the hot water, or pay extra for a meal of bread and cheese to be served to you in the tub. Some reports even describe musicians being hired to play lutes or pipes while bathers relaxed, the soft notes echoing strangely through the dense clouds of mist. Imagine laughing with your neighbors, your cheeks flushed from a heat that penetrates to the bone, while the city just beyond your door groans under the weight of the frost. Academic voices still wrestle with how common these establishments truly were. Some historians argue they were widespread and surprisingly affordable, accessible to artisans and merchants as well as to the nobility. Others point out that many bathhouses disappeared by the late Middle Ages, partly due to growing fears of disease transmission and partly from a rising tide of moral suspicion about what went on within their steamy walls. The truth, as with so much of daily life, likely varied by region, thriving in one town, fading away in another. You might never know for certain how accessible they were, but as you sink into the warm water here and now, you don't care about the scholarly disputes. You care only about the glorious sensation of your fingers finally, truly beginning to thaw. You lower yourself further, the water biting hot at first, a pleasant shock, before your body seems to melt into it. The sensation is overwhelming after weeks of enduring icy drafts. To feel a deep, pervasive heat surrounding every single inch of you is almost shocking. Your skin prickles, sweat beads on your forehead, and your very muscles seem to sigh in profound gratitude. The air smells of damp, heated wood, and of the fragrant herbs tossed into the water: rosemary, thyme, maybe even a touch of lavender if the owner is feeling generous. All around you, people murmur in low, relaxed voices, the steam clouding their faces into anonymous, contented shadows. Some lean their heads back, eyes closed, drifting near a waking sleep. Others chatter animatedly, palpably relieved to speak without shivering for the first time in days. The bathhouse becomes a microcosm of comfort, a fragile, blessed bubble of warmth holding back the cruel winter. And you understand exactly why these places were so beloved. Here, for an hour or two, you could completely forget the cruelty of the season. Of course, such profound comfort always carried risks. Fires roared constantly beneath the heavy water vats, and an accident could easily scald or burn. Too much time in the intense heat might leave you dizzy and weak, paradoxically vulnerable to a deep chill the moment you stepped back outside. And the rumors constantly swirled about bathhouses being dens of vice, leading to stricter laws that would eventually close many of them down in later centuries. But in this moment, sitting in the fragrant steam, those dangers feel remote and insignificant. You simply close your eyes and listen to the gentle splash of water, the distant crackle of the furnace fire, and the low, contented hum of human voices, all of it softened and muted by the mist. When you finally emerge, your entire body glows with a deep inner heat. The cold air outside slaps against your skin, a brutal welcome back to reality, but you find yourself laughing instead of groaning. For a while at least, your inner warmth shields you. It is a memory of fire carried in your very blood. By the time you return to your dwelling, the chill will have begun to settle in again. The drafts will return to their work. But the bathhouse has given you something exceptionally rare, a taste of true, absolute comfort in a season that usually offers none. You tuck the experience away in your mind like a secret, precious ember. Tomorrow you will wake to frost and smoke, to aching joints and the sight of your own icy breath. But tonight, you will drift into sleep still wrapped in a phantom steam. The warmth of the bathhouse lingers in your memory, a golden standard against which all other comforts are measured. But back in the drafty rhythm of everyday life, that comfort must often be coaxed from smaller, more practical contraptions. You glance across a dimly lit chamber and notice a curious object. It is a shallow metal pan, often with a pierced lid, perched on short legs or sometimes carried by a handle. It glows with a faint, reassuring red from the embers held within, radiating a fragile, localized heat into the smoky air. You have met the brazier, the portable, personal firebox of the medieval world. Contemporary inventories and detailed household accounts make it plain that braziers were a favored solution for targeted warmth in both urban homes and wealthier rural households. Filled with hot charcoal or glowing coals scooped directly from the main hearth, they could be moved into smaller rooms, offering a precious pocket of warmth where the great central fire could not reach. Servants carried them into bedchambers to pre-warm the air. Guild members clustered around them in their meeting halls, and city officials kept them smouldering in drafty council chambers to keep their fingers nimble enough to write. And here is a curious little practice. In some Mediterranean towns, particularly in Spain and Italy, families would place a brazier under a low wooden table that was draped with a heavy cloth. People would sit around it with the fabric tucked into their laps, effectively creating a small, intensely heated tent for their lower bodies. This clever contraption, known later as the brasero, or the kotatsu in other cultural parallels, turned a simple mealtime into a cozy, communal refuge. Imagine the sheer delight of slipping your frozen feet from the cold floor into a hidden pocket of trapped, radiant heat waiting to greet you. Experts, however, continue to debate the safety and practicality of these braziers. On the one hand, they were ingenious, relatively cheap, completely portable, and surprisingly effective. On the other, the danger of suffocation from the carbon monoxide they produced was very, very real. Written accounts survive of entire families found dead in the morning, after having left a brazier smouldering overnight in a poorly ventilated room. Some modern scholars argue these tragedies were rare, but were sensationalized due to their horrific nature. Others maintain that the risk was constant and widely feared. What is certain is that the brazier was both a loyal friend and a potential executioner, an object welcomed with profound gratitude, but always treated with a healthy dose of suspicion. You watch now as a servant shuffles past, carefully carrying one of these devices. The coals within are glowing faintly, and a fine powder of ash spills like grey snowflakes with each cautious step. The smell is sharp, metallic, tinged with the unmistakable scent of burning charcoal. He sets it down near a cluster of people, and they immediately lean in, stretching out their hands, sighing audibly at the relief. The gentle glow illuminates their faces, their eyes closing briefly as if they have just remembered what warmth truly feels like. You edge closer too, letting the heat brush against your skin. It is not an overwhelming heat, more like the ghost of summer than summer itself, but it takes the sharp, biting sting out of the air. Your shins tingle, your fingers begin to relax, and for the first time that day, you feel your shoulders uncurl from their defensive hunch. The brazier becomes a little hearth of its own, a small center of gravity that draws people together. Around its fragile warmth, conversation begins. Laughter stirs. Even old arguments seem easier to handle when you are not frozen stiff. But this comfort has its strict limits. The further you sit from it, the more quickly the cold regains control. The heat is intensely local, not universal. And as soon as the embers begin to dim, the entire illusion of comfort collapses. You watch the servant return with a pair of iron tongs, shaking the coals, blowing on them gently until they flare again with a brief, renewed vigor. Everyone waits, hunched and hopeful, for that small renewal. It is easy to see why braziers became such potent symbols of both ingenuity and anxiety. They solved a problem elegantly, how to heat large, cold stone buildings with limited fuel, but they never solved it entirely or safely. You could not walk away from them without risk. You could not sleep safely beside them. You had to live in constant conversation with their hazards, balancing a deep gratitude and a healthy fear with every single glow. The night deepens, and the brazier still smoulders, its little heart of fire holding back the immense cold for as long as it can. You lean closer, feeling its warm breath against your skin, and you think to yourself, warmth in this world is always partial, always temporary. But even a fragment of comfort, even a single faint red ember in a pan of ash, can mean the difference between despair and survival. The brazier's faint glow finally fades into darkness, its temporary comfort extinguished, leaving you once more dependent on the dwindling central hearth. Outside, the wind sends a skeletal rattle through the shutters and shakes the very thatch of the roof. In the silence between gusts, you can almost hear the mournful groan of bare branches in the forest just beyond the village. Wood was the absolute lifeblood of every fire. Yet, in this world, not everyone could gather it freely. You step outside into the brittle, crystalline morning air, and the daily struggle becomes starkly, immediately clear. Firewood itself was a contested, precious treasure. Records from manorial rolls and royal decrees confirm that access to the great forests was tightly and jealously controlled throughout much of medieval Europe. By the 12th century, vast swathes of ancient woodland were claimed as exclusive hunting reserves for kings and their lords. To cut down a living tree without permission could mean severe fines, a public beating, or far worse. The peasants were permitted to scavenge what had already fallen: the dead branches, the brush, the discarded scraps, but to fell a tree and drag home a heavy, life-sustaining log was often to risk a terrible punishment. Fire, paradoxically, was both absolutely essential for life and in many ways forbidden. Here's one of those unexpected corners of history born from desperation. People became masters of using every last scrap. Tiny twigs, heaps of dried leaves, sun-baked animal dung, and even tightly bound bundles of straw were all fed to the flames when proper logs were scarce. In some coastal regions, villagers would gather seaweed, spreading it out to dry on the rocks before piling it into smoky, pungent fuel heaps. Imagine the smell. Acrid, salty, a far cry from the clean, satisfying crackle of oak, yet still capable of keeping a precious ember alive for another long night. In this world, fuel was less about preference and far more about possibility. Historians are not united on just how severe this scarcity truly became during the Middle Ages. Some argue that woodland management was surprisingly sustainable in many regions, with prudent lords planting new groves and regulating cutting to avoid complete disaster. Others insist that by the late medieval period, wood shortages were devastatingly real and pressing, pushing entire communities toward alternative fuels like peat and the early use of coal. The evidence differs from region to region, but the very existence of the debate underscores one fundamental truth. You could never, ever take firewood for granted. You hoist an axe, testing its familiar weight in your hands. The thought of trudging into the Lord's forbidden forest fills you with a conflicting mix of deep longing and gnawing fear. The trees stand there, silent and regal, cloaked in a layer of frost, their thick trunks representing a silent, taunting promise of weeks of heat. If only you could claim them. But the penalty for poaching is brutally steep. So, you stoop instead, your back already aching, collecting the fallen branches which are brittle and disappointingly light, hardly enough fuel to cook a single decent meal. Children scatter through the underbrush like small foragers, chasing after twigs as if they were treasure, their small fingers red raw with the cold, their meager bundles tied up with scraps of string. Back at home, you watch the woodpile dwindle, day by agonizing day. Each log that is placed on the fire is the result of a grim calculation. Should it be used now, for a moment of comfort, or saved for a night that is certain to be colder still? Families became unwitting experts in stretching their supply, banking fires with ash to make them smolder slowly, cooking meals quickly, and layering on more clothing instead of another log. Sometimes, the hearth was only lit for the preparation of meals, and for the rest of the long day, the family simply endured the frost in silence. Comfort was rationed as carefully as coin, and every single ember carried an immense weight. The smell of the smoke itself was not always pleasant. Wet, unseasoned wood would hiss and spit, filling the small room with acrid, eye-watering fumes. Resinous pine popped and snapped violently, sending a dangerous spray of sparks across the earthen floor. Oak, the king of woods, burned slowly, steadily, and with a deep, satisfying heat. It was coveted most of all. You feel the distinct personality and difference in every log. Some burn too fast, some too smoky, and some, blessedly, are just right. Firewood became a language all its own, each type telling a different story of survival. And yet, through it all, you remember the bitter, unavoidable truth. Many could not gather enough fuel at all. The winter bit hardest for those who were too poor, too old, or too weak to haul branches back from the woods. Neighbours sometimes shared, it is true, but scarcity also bred a dark suspicion. A missing bundle from a neighbour's pile could mean an accusation of theft, a bitter quarrel, and sometimes even violence. Firewood, just like bread, was a form of survival currency. As dusk begins to fall, you sit by the meager blaze, watching it lick weakly at the last log of the day. Your hands ache from splitting wood, your back from carrying it, but still the pile shrinks. You know that tomorrow you will have to return to the hedges and the forest edge, searching for more, always hoping the Lord's reeve doesn't catch you straying too close to the forbidden trees. The winter is long and the wood is always short. And so, as the fire sputters and the shadows in the cottage thicken, you realize that medieval warmth was never free. It was hunted, hoarded, and fiercely defended. Every single flame had a cost, and every log was a small, hard-won victory carved out of an endless scarcity. The woodpile dwindles, and soon there is nothing left but a pathetic collection of twigs, bark scraps, and a few stubborn, dried lumps of animal dung. You sigh, a plume of white in the cold, rubbing your numb hands together as you glance toward the marshland that lies vast and grey beyond the village. That is where another kind of fuel awaits. It is a fuel you would not call elegant, but it is one that has saved countless winters from utter despair. Peat and turf. Written sources from the damp landscapes of Ireland, Scotland, and across parts of northern Europe leave little doubt that for centuries, people would systematically cut dense blocks of peat from the bogs, dry them through the summer, and stack them like dark, earthen bricks for burning. Archaeologists today can still find the telltale traces of these practices in the long, straight ridges carved into ancient peatlands, the physical evidence of centuries of a slow and laborious harvest. Peat didn't blaze with the cheerful violence of wood. It smouldered, a slow, smoky, and pungent burn. But in a world where wood was scarce or too tightly controlled by avaricious lords, peat was survival dug straight out of the ground. An odd detail, one that speaks to its immense value, often surfaces in local records. Families treated their peat stacks with an almost ceremonial care. The heavy, wet blocks were cut in the spring, laid out to dry in long, neat rows under the weak sun, and then gathered and piled meticulously against a cottage wall or a stone fence. To lose your peat pile to opportunistic thieves or a sudden flood was a disaster on par with losing your entire winter's supply of food. Some households even locked their precious bog bricks away in sheds, guarding them as if they were a hoard of treasure. Not all researchers agree on how truly effective peat was as a fuel source. Some argue it produced far more smoke than actual heat, filling the small cottages with a thick, tarry haze that would coat everything and everyone in a greasy black film. Others insist that once properly dried, peat provided a steady, long-lasting, and reliable warmth, perfect for the slow cooking of stews and for keeping a fire alive through the long, treacherous nights. The truth may simply depend on how well each community harvested and prepared it, and whether a damp summer left the blocks soggy and frustratingly useless. You picture yourself now, standing in the bog, the soles of your boots sinking into the soft, yielding earth, the heavy, organic smell of wet moss thick in the air. You swing a special long-bladed spade, slicing neat, rectangular blocks from the ancient ground, each one making a wet, squelching sound as it lifts free. Your back begins to ache quickly from the repetitive, heavy work, but you keep cutting, carefully stacking the wet bricks on the bank to dry in the wind. The work is filthy, staining your hands and clothes, but each block feels like a piece of future life. Each completed row stands as a silent promise that your hearth will not go dark this winter. Back at home, you feed one of the dried bricks into the dying fire. It doesn't roar, it sighs. A slow, smoky glow spreads outward, radiating a gentle heat. The smell is earthy, almost sweet, a scent that curls into your clothes and hair until you feel you are wearing the very essence of the bog on your skin. You cough at first, your lungs protesting the thick smoke, but then you manage a faint smile. The heat is gentler than wood and much steadier. It will not warm the entire room, but it will keep the embers alive while you sleep, sparing you the heart-stopping dread of waking to a dead, cold hearth. Your neighbours glance at your peat stack with a mixture of respect and envy, asking how much you managed to cut this year, whether you might be willing to trade a few bricks for a loaf of bread or a hank of wool. You hesitate, knowing that your own pile must last through the long, dark months. Still, a few bricks always find their way to friends in need, because survival here is never just an individual struggle. It is a shared, communal burden. One night you may save them, and on another night they may well save you. The fire smoulders deep into the night, the peat bricks glowing a deep, sullen red like buried jewels. The smoke stings your eyes, further blackens the already soot-stained rafters, and makes your throat feel scratchy and raw, but you endure it. You know that outside, the frost is sharpening its teeth. The snow is thickening on the ground, and the winds are scraping across the barren land. But inside at least your hearth breathes, fed by the earth itself. You lie down on your straw pallet, pulling the heavy blanket tighter. The room smells of bog and smoke. It is not a pleasant smell, but it is a strangely comforting one. It is the smell of continuity, of a fuel that does not run out as quickly as precious wood. And you realize that peat, humble, messy, and malodorous, has turned your fragile cottage into a small pocket of stubborn, earthy survival. When dawn finally comes, pale and bitterly cold, the embers are still alive. You poke them gently, coaxing a new flame from the peat's lingering, generous heart. And you whisper your thanks not to the forest which the Lord has forbidden you, but to the bog which gave its gift freely. If only you were willing to stoop, to cut, and to endure its muck. The bog's smoky gift still lingers in your clothes when you hear another sound. A new sound, distant and muffled, like the creaking of carts under impossibly heavy loads. You follow it toward the riverbank, and there you see them. Men blackened with a soot that is different, deeper, their faces grimed as they unload heavy sacks and baskets. The smell hits you first, a sharp, chemical acridity, entirely unlike wood or peat. This is coal, the black stone, the fuel that will one day remake the entire world. But here, in the Middle Ages, it is still a strange curiosity, creeping slowly and uncertainly into daily life. Records from places like Durham, Newcastle, and along the English rivers show that by the 13th century, sea coal found washed up on beaches was already being hauled by boat and cart to nearby towns. It burned far hotter than wood, it lasted much longer, and savvy merchants quickly saw its commercial value. Yet for most inland villages, it remained an oddity, dirty, foul-smelling, and deeply unfamiliar. Some lords purchased it for their castles, especially in areas close to mines, but further from the source, many peasants had never even seen a lump. And here's a curious little wrinkle in the story. Early on, people were profoundly suspicious of coal smoke. Chroniclers of the time describe Londoners complaining bitterly that it fouled the air, blackened their walls, and sickened their lungs. There are even accounts of noble women who refused to enter houses where coal fires burned, claiming the noxious smoke completely ruined their expensive clothing. Despite these protests, the fuel continued to spread, because when the forests thinned and wood prices inevitably rose, coal offered something essential: consistency. You could dig it, haul it, and stack it in great heaps that would outlast any pile of logs. Scholars remain divided on just how widespread coal use became during the medieval period. Some argue it was limited mostly to the mining regions themselves and to large towns where river transport made it practical. Others suggest that by the late 14th century, coal was already beginning to reshape urban life, powering industries like smithing and brewing, in addition to warming domestic hearths. The truth is tangled in patchy evidence, charred fragments found in archaeological digs, city ordinances grumbling about the smoke, scattered household accounts. Still, its creeping, inexorable presence is undeniable. You squat near a coal heap, picking up a single lump. It stains your fingers instantly, leaving deep black smudges. The texture is rough, brittle at the edges, almost like a strange, light stone pretending to be wood. You sniff it, wrinkle your nose at the chemical tang, and toss it into a nearby brazier. At first, it just smoulders sullenly, without drama. Then, suddenly, it catches, flaring with a fierce, almost violent, steady heat. The room warms more quickly than you expect, though the smoke that curls from it is thick and biting. You cough, waving your hand in front of your face, but you cannot deny the raw, concentrated power in this little black rock. Around you, people mutter their opinions. One old man swears he'll never burn the foul stuff. claiming its fumes will poison his family. Another man brags that his small coal pile will outlast his neighbor's entire wood stack. Children watch, wide-eyed, as the flames lick with a strange blue color against the lumps, a magical light they have never seen emerge from burning logs. A woman shakes her head at the sheer mess of it, rubbing soot from her apron, but she doesn't stop feeding the brazier. The debate can wait. The coal is hot, and hot means survival. The harsh smell clings to your hair and seeps deep into your cloak. You imagine London a century from now, its streets perpetually veiled in smoke, its new chimneys belching coal soot into every corner of the city. Already kings and councils were issuing complaints, trying to regulate its use. Yet the demand only grew. People will tolerate a great deal when their warmth is on the line. Night falls, and you sit by the brazier once more. The coal glows a deep, powerful red, steady and strong, while the wind outside continues to rattle the shutters. You rub your hands together, marveling at how much longer this single fire lasts compared to wood or peat. You know it is dirtier, harsher, and somehow less natural. But you also have a sense that many winters from now, villages and great cities alike, will come to depend on this black stone more than on any log from any forest. You are watching not just a fire, but a transformation, a new, uncertain chapter in humanity's endless, brutal fight against the cold. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize that warmth in this world is never simple. Each fuel carries its own price: wood with scarcity, peat with smoke, and coal with soot. Yet all of them are embraced, because winter never negotiates. It only demands, and you must answer with whatever will burn. The coal smoulders steadily, a persistent, powerful heat, but its acrid smoke makes you long for a different kind of warmth, one that carries not a chemical tang, but the wholesome, life-affirming smell of baking bread. You follow that faintest of scents down a treacherous, muddy lane, and soon you arrive at the true, beating heart of every medieval community: the kitchen. This is not just your own smoky hearth, but the larger, bustling spaces where food and fire came together in a powerful alchemy that often made them the warmest, most desirable places anyone could find. Household accounts and the vivid scenes in medieval illustrations show clearly that kitchens were designed not just for the act of cooking, but for the deliberate concentration of heat. Great ovens were built of heavy clay or stone, their cavernous domes glowing with a deep internal heat for hours after the initial inferno of burning logs had died down. Once the flames were raked out, the stored radiant heat lingered, a perfect, gentle energy for baking bread, roasting meat, or drying a villager's perpetually damp clothes. In wealthier households, kitchens were often deliberately placed in separate buildings, set apart from the main hall to reduce the ever-present risk of smoke and catastrophic fire. But in the depths of winter, these same utilitarian rooms became coveted, almost sacred refuges, alive with the glorious smell of roasted grain and the comforting sound of bubbling pots. And here's one of those unexpected, heartwarming details. In many towns, large communal ovens were built for all the villagers to share. Families would prepare their dough at home and bring it to the local baker, who would then slide the unbaked loaves into massive, fiery ovens that could bake dozens at once. People would often linger while they waited, crowding near the glowing, open mouths of these ovens, not just to watch their bread, but simply to feel the intense heat. Imagine the vibrant scene, the constant chatter, the fidgeting children, the neighbors exchanging gossip, all while basking in the radiant warmth that seeped deep into their chilled bones. The bread was important, certainly, but the fire, in that moment, was irresistible. Historians remain divided on whether these kitchens and bakehouses truly served as deliberate social hubs or were simply practical necessities. Some argue they became informal gathering places during the winter, drawing villagers in for both the physical warmth and the warmth of human company. Others believe their role was more transactional, with little time spent loitering in the oppressive cold. The evidence is patchy, drawn from scattered accounts and local regulations concerning oven use. Yet, as you step into one of these kitchens now, the academic debate hardly matters. The sudden, welcome rush of heat against your frozen skin feels like proof enough. The kitchen itself is alive. It is a symphony of survival. Sparks leap from a central hearth, where a great cauldron swings gently on its iron chain, the metal creaking with the rhythm of every stir. The mouth of the great oven glows like a miniature sunrise, its clay arch so hot that it makes you flinch when you lean too close. A servant, his face slick with sweat, pulls a paddle of finished bread from within. The crusts are blackened at the edges, and the smell of it fills every single inch of the air. A scent so powerful, it feels like a physical presence. Another servant wipes sweat from his brow, his body completely oblivious to the frost that coats the world outside. For him, in this bubble of heat, winter hardly exists. The fire banishes it completely. You edge closer, allowing the glorious warmth to soak into your stiff, aching fingers. The floor is dusty with a fine layer of flour, the air heavy with smoke, but none of it matters when your body finally, blessedly begins to thaw. You watch a young boy toss an armful of kindling into the hearth, his movements practiced and efficient, his face ruddy with the constant heat. He grins at you, a quick, knowing look, and you understand completely. This is the best room in the house, perhaps the best room in the entire village when the snow lies thick and deep on the frozen fields. In poorer homes, the kitchen hearth was smaller, a more humble affair, but its essential role was exactly the same. Families gathered around it, not just to eat, but to exist. Meals were slow cooked for hours, a practice born partly from efficiency, and partly because a simmering pot guaranteed that the precious hearth stayed alive and warm. Even the meanest scraps of vegetables or leftover bones became fuel for warmth as much as for sustenance. The smell of cooking wasn't just about hunger. It was a profound reassurance that the fire, the heart of the home, had survived another day. Still, these vital spaces carried their own grave dangers. Sparks constantly leaped onto the dry straw that covered the floors. Hot grease from roasting meats could flare up in an instant, and the smoke, as always, often stung eyes until they watered uncontrollably. Regulations in medieval towns frequently mentioned the fire risk posed by bakeries, warning of heavy fines if ovens were left untended. Entire streets sometimes burned to the ground because one single kitchen spark had escaped into the night. Yet people accepted this constant risk, because without the fire there was no warmth, no bread, no life. You lean back now against the kitchen wall, feeling the stored heat of the stones seep into your back, loosening muscles you didn't even know were clenched. The room hums with the steady, comforting rhythm of work, the sharp chop of knives on wood, the gentle bubbling of the cauldrons, the sound of voices calling instructions over the constant, cheerful crackle of the flames. Outside, the frost still rules with an iron fist, but inside this kitchen, the balance of power shifts. For these few precious hours, this little chamber is a world unto itself, a world defined not by cold, but by heat, not by silence, but by sustenance. And as you close your eyes, breathing deeply of the mingled scents of wood smoke and fresh bread, you realize that the medieval kitchen was so much more than functional. These were havens glowing, living pockets of life where community and comfort finally, blessedly converged. If the great hall showed a lord's wealth, and the private chamber showed intimacy, the kitchen showed pure survival. Fire transformed into food, and warmth transformed into fellowship. The comforting warmth of the kitchen clings to your clothes like a fond memory, but the moment you step outside, the wind bites again, its teeth seemingly sharper for the contrast. You shiver, clutching your cloak tightly, and find yourself following another trail of smoke, not from the chimneys of homes this time, but from places where work itself generated an intense, industrial heat. In the very heart of the town, you find them. The bakeries and the breweries, their chimneys belching clouds of steam and smoke. Their doors often left ajar as a steady stream of villagers slip inside to chase a moment of warmth alongside their daily bread and ale. City records and the formal documents of medieval guilds confirm a simple truth. Bakeries and breweries were not just vital economic centres, but also accidental, unofficial shelters during the long winter. The great ovens in the bakeries often ran day and night, especially in larger towns where their communal loaves fed hundreds. The breweries, too, boiled vast quantities of mash and wort in great steaming vats, filling the air with a yeasty, malty warmth that would spread out invitingly into the frozen street. For many villagers, lingering near these open doors was an unspoken rite, a a simple way to thaw frozen hands and numb faces without ever having to ask permission. And here is a peculiar little scene, preserved in a few scattered chronicles. On the coldest days, apprentices and children would press their backs flat against the outer walls of the bakeries, soaking in the heat from the ovens that seeped straight through the thick stone. Picture a silent row of villagers leaning like lizards against a sun-warmed rock, perhaps sharing a quiet laugh at their own simple cleverness while the rest of the street remained locked in frost. It was not an elegant solution, but it was survival by proximity. Specialists, of course, continue to debate just how accessible these warm working places truly were. Some argue that bakers would have strictly controlled their ovens, ever wary of fire hazards and the meddling of outsiders. Others counter that in the close quarters of crowded urban life, it was simply inevitable that neighbours, beggars and cold children would hover at the doors, drawn by the irresistible promise of heat. The truth is likely somewhere in between. A presence that was tolerated until it became disruptive, and quietly discouraged when the cost of fuel grew too high. But for you, standing here now with the warm, yeasty air wrapping around your face, the scholarly quarrel is entirely irrelevant. Warmth is warmth, wherever it leaks from. You push open the heavy wooden door of the bakery and are met with a solid, breathtaking wall of heat. The great oven glows a fierce white orange, its mouth a veritable cave of fire, while men with long wooden paddles slide loaves in and out with an practiced, almost dance-like rhythm. The air inside is thick with fine flour dust and a haze of wood smoke, yet you feel your shoulders unclench almost immediately. Sensation returns to your fingers. The dull ache in your toes finally begins to subside. The rich, intoxicating scent of baking bread seeps deep into your chest, a promise of both sustenance and comfort. Nearby, a group of women gossip as they wait for their own dough to be baked. Children chase each other between the wooden benches, and a stray dog, wise in the ways of the town, curls up beneath a table, too blissfully content to be chased out. You realize this place is more than just a workplace. It is a magnet. People are drawn to its fire, as moths are drawn to a flame, not only for the food it produces, but for the profound relief it offers. A short walk away, the local brewery is just as inviting, though its heat is of a different kind. Steam billows from great copper cauldrons where malted barley simmers, and the air is heavy with a sweet, earthy fragrance. Burly workers stir the thick mash with long wooden poles, sweat shining on their brows, even as a delicate crust of frost forms on the inside of the windows. You step inside, and the humid warmth envelops you like a thick, damp blanket. The sound of bubbling liquid, the hiss of escaping steam, the cheerful clatter of mugs being filled, it all merges into a vibrant symphony of comfort. Of course, dangers lurked here too. The fires burned constantly. The fuel was consumed at a staggering rate, and terrible accidents with the boiling liquid could be deadly. Regulations in some towns specifically mention breweries as significant fire hazards, requiring regular inspections or special taxes to help offset the risk to the surrounding community. But none of that stops people from slipping into the steamy air for a moment, breathing deeply as if the warmth itself could be swallowed and held inside. You linger, watching the brewer lift a frothing mug and take a long sip, his cheeks already flushed with heat. Workers laugh and joke with one another despite their heavy labor, their bodies too warm to even care about the winter that is pressing at the doors. For a fleeting moment, you feel a pang of envy. What must it be like to spend every day surrounded by this constant, reliable heat, even if it comes with the price of sweat and risk? By the time you finally leave, your clothes carry the mingled smells of bread and beer, a scent layered over the ever-present smoke. Outside, the frost is still waiting for you, but you feel fortified, as though you have managed to steal a small portion of the bakery's fire and the brewery's steam to carry with you on your way. These places were never meant to be refuges, and yet they became their industries unintentionally doubling as public hearths for their entire communities. And as you walk home, the cold closing in on you once again, you realize that true warmth in this world often came not from private guarded fires, but from the heat of shared labor. To hover near the great ovens and boiling vats was to borrow the heat of work itself, to let survival sneak in alongside the simple, honest making of daily bread and ale. The ghost of yeast and wood smoke still clings to you as the night finally closes in, a faint reminder of the day's borrowed warmth. You retreat from the biting air of the street, your own breath blooming in a sudden white cloud before you, and enter a small, quiet chamber, lit by the gentle dance of a single lamp. There, resting on a wooden table, lies another ingenious invention for keeping life in your very fingertips. A hand warmer, the intimate and secretive cousin of the public brazier. Household records and delicate finds from archaeological digs tell us that these portable hand warmers, small metal containers filled with glowing charcoal, were carried by the well-to-do throughout the colder months. They were artfully crafted from brass, bronze, or sometimes simple iron, often featuring intricately pierced lids designed to let the heat escape in a controlled, gentle measure. Some were plain and utilitarian. Others were beautifully ornamented with delicate cutwork designs that would cast faint, shifting patterns of light when the embers glowed within. These personal embers could be slipped inside a voluminous sleeve, tucked deep into the folds of a cloak, or carried like a tiny personal lantern of warmth through the bitterest of streets. And here's one of those delightful historical oddities. In Italy and Spain, these devices were sometimes disguised as ornate, hollowed-out spheres, almost like oversized golden apples that you could cradle discreetly and elegantly in your palms. It is said that women often used them at church, concealing the faint glow under their shawls while kneeling for hours on the icy stone floors. Imagine an entire congregation murmuring their prayers, piety etched on every solemn face, while hidden beneath the heavy folds of wool, dozens of these tiny, coal-filled orbs kept their fingers from stiffening into useless claws of ice. There is, of course, a debate among historians about how widely accessible such warmers truly were. Some argue they were rare and costly luxuries, restricted to the nobles, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking clergy who could afford both the fine metalwork and the steady supply of charcoal needed to fuel them. Others suggest that simpler, cruder versions, perhaps small clay pots with holes punched in the lid, or even crude iron cups were common enough in towns, especially in regions where the winters were particularly harsh. The truth is likely a spectrum, with ornate, gleaming warmers in aristocratic halls and their humbler, quieter cousins glowing secretly in villages. You lift one now, its polished surface already warm against your palms. The metal radiates a steady, persistent heat, not scorching, but a deep and living warmth, like the profound comfort of holding a small, sleeping animal. You tuck it carefully into your sleeve, and the gentle heat begins to creep up your arm, easing the familiar ache in joints grown stiff from the pervasive cold. You feel a strange and sudden intimacy with this small device. It is not the blazing communal hearth that fills a room with its boisterous life, but a quiet personal companion you carry with you, a secret ember held against the world's vast indifference. The air around it smells faintly metallic as the charcoal slowly burns down. You hear the occasional soft pop of an ember shifting inside its metal prison, a quiet reminder that even this tiny, controlled comfort is borrowed from fire's wild and unpredictable nature. Children eye it curiously, their hands tempted to reach for it, but they have been warned of the burns it can inflict. You remember the cautionary tales of clumsy servants dropping one into a pile of dry straw or a bolt of cloth, igniting a disaster from the very thing that was meant to soothe. Every single ember in the Middle Ages carried both salvation and danger, even in something so small, yet you cannot deny its profound usefulness. As you step back outside into the night, the warmer tucked close to your body, you feel immediately shielded against the biting force of the wind. Your cloak flaps around you, your cheeks begin to sting, but your hands remain alive, the blood flowing freely instead of seizing up in painful numbness. This small device allows you to walk further, to work longer, and to endure more than you ever could barehanded. In the bustling winter markets, you notice the merchants huddling with their own warmers, lifting the lids now and then to stir the embers back to life. A scribe, tucked into a cold corner, warms his fingers for a moment before returning to his delicate work on a sheet of parchment. A woman selling woolen caps leans over hers as if it were a trusted confidant, muttering to herself as the indifferent crowd presses by. Each warmer is intensely personal, deeply private, a portable hearth carried into the coldest corners of daily life. And when you finally return to your own dwelling, you slip it beside your straw pallet, its faint glow fading slowly as you drift towards sleep. It does not heat the whole room. It does not banish the cold, but it keeps your small world just bearable enough. And that, you realize, is the essential truth of medieval warmth. It was not about achieving grand, absolute comfort, but about securing a series of small, hard-won victories scattered like embers against the darkness. Each one just enough to push back the frost for another precious hour. The little hand warmer fades to cold, dead ash, and you stretch your stiff shoulders, a deep ache settling in your bones. In that moment, you realize a profound truth. Even with clever tools and small inventions, the cold presses on, relentless and indifferent. The body itself, this fragile vessel of warmth and life, becomes the last fortress. You instinctively tug your cloak tighter, and as you look around, you notice how every villager, every monk, every noble combats the winter in the same fundamental way, in layers. They are building a personal warmth, not from walls or fires alone, but from the very clothing that becomes a kind of wearable armor. Contemporary records and the analysis of surviving archaeological textiles confirm that wool was the undisputed backbone of medieval winter wear. Peasants wrapped themselves in its coarse, undyed embrace, while the wealthy draped themselves in finer cloth, often dyed with the expensive, vibrant pigments that declared their status to the world. Wool was prized above all other fabrics for one near-magical property: its ability to hold heat, even when damp, an incalculable blessing in a season where snow constantly melted on your shoulders and icy sleet soaked your hems. Beneath this outer layer, people wore shifts and shirts of linen. The fabric was smoother against the skin, and it would be layered thickly when the weather grew truly cruel. And here's one of those fascinating historical quirks. In the colder northern regions of Europe, garments were sometimes stuffed with raw, unprocessed fleece, or even scraps of leftover fabric to create a thick, quilted padding. In effect, early medieval folk, through pure necessity, stumbled upon a version of insulation we would readily recognize today. Some of these outfits were so bulky that they severely restricted movement, but when a frostbitten wind howled across the frozen fields, nobody cared how graceful you looked. There are even surviving illustrations showing children bundled to the point of utter absurdity, their forms lost in cocooned layers, leaving them as little more than a pair of bright eyes peeking out at the world. Researchers continue to disagree on just how much fur was worn by everyday people. Some argue that it was a luxury reserved almost exclusively for the nobles, who flaunted the lush pelts of ermine, sable, and fox as unmistakable symbols of prestige. Others insist that even common villagers had access to more humble furs, the practical warmth of sheepskin, the soft pelts of rabbit, or the tough hide of a goat lining their boots and cloaks with whatever scraps they could acquire, even if they lacked the sweeping elegance of aristocratic garments. What is certain is that fur, whether rich or ragged, was an invaluable barrier for keeping the winter's deep chill out of the very bones. You pull on a heavy cloak now, its wool rough against your hands, but utterly reliable. A deep hood shadows your face, creating a small tunnel of personal space that cuts the immediate sting of the wind. Beneath it, a linen tunic itches faintly against your skin, and you've wrapped strips of old rags around your feet in makeshift socks before forcing them into leather shoes that have grown stiff as boards with the frost. The layers make you feel clumsy and slow, but you are profoundly grateful. Each piece of fabric is another wall, another rampart between your living body and the season that waits to gnaw at your marrow. In the noble halls, of course, the scene is far more extravagant. Ladies sweep past in heavy gowns lined with soft fur, their voluminous sleeves trailing behind them like banners, while men wear padded doublets beneath richly embroidered surcoats. The garments are dazzling, a spectacle of wealth and colour, but they also serve intensely practical needs. A thick fur collar shields a throat from the ever-present draughts. A long woolen cloak traps a pocket of warm air when drawn tightly across the chest. Even high fashion was forced to bend its knee to the demands of winter, though wealth allowed that necessity to be masqueraded as style. The raw, honest smell of lanolin clings to you, an earthy and faintly sour scent. It is the natural odor of wool that has never been fully washed free of its protective grease, a smell familiar to every single medieval nose. As you walk, your cloak grows heavier with accumulated snowflakes, dampening slowly, but you can feel it still holding its precious heat close to your body. You notice others shaking out their own garments, muttering at the increasing weight, but smiling grimly because they know that without these heavy, sodden layers, they would already be frozen. Children chase each other in the street, their laughter sharp and clear in the frigid air, their own small cloaks flapping wildly behind them. Their mittens are patched, their boots crudely wrapped in extra cloth. They don't complain. They have known no other kind of winter than this. You see them gather for a moment near a public brazier, their cloaks steaming faintly as the melted frost turns to vapor, the unique smell of wet wool filling the air. And when you finally return home, you hang your damp cloak near the fire, watching it smoke gently as it begins to dry. Tomorrow it will be stiff again with a mixture of frost and dried wool, ready to protect you once more. It is then that you realize that survival here is not just about fire or food. It is about the fabric on your back, the layers wrapped carefully around your body, the animal skins and the woven cloth that become as necessary to life as breath itself. For in this harsh world, clothes are not mere ornaments, they are shields. Each tunic, each scrap of fur lining, each rag-wrapped boot is a critical line of defense in the endless war against winter. And without this woven armor, no hearth, no brazier, and no peat brick could ever save you for long. Your damp cloak still smoulders faintly by the fire, the wool slowly releasing its moisture from the day's melted snow. But even dressed in your protective layers, you cannot help but notice how profoundly the season imposes its own deliberate tempo. In the medieval world, winter was not merely a chill in the air, it was a force that fundamentally rewrote the very architecture of daily life. The chronicles and seasonal calendars of the age make it clear that all of human activity, from work to leisure, bent to the will of the cold months. Agricultural labor slowed to a crawl as the iron-hard earth refused the plough. Ploughing halted, the great fields lay dormant under a blanket of frost, and only the ever-present needs of livestock demanded steady, daily care. The shortening of the days meant the lengthening of the nights. Most households would rise later and retreat to their beds far earlier, their precious waking hours bound tightly to the unsteady flicker of firelight. The pace of life itself grew sluggish, heavy, as if entire populations were hibernating in human form. And yet, there is a curious and beautiful twist in these seasonal patterns. Because the relentless outdoor labor slowed, winter became a time for indoor crafts and vital communal gatherings. By the light of the hearth, women would spin wool or flax, the rhythmic thrum of the spinning wheel becoming the season's gentle heartbeat. Men would undertake the quiet, patient work of mending the tools that the summer had worn down. Children would help to twist rushes into the thin tapers that would serve as the night's lights. Storytelling flourished in the long, dark hours, with ancient songs and clever riddles filling the smoky halls. In many villages, the freezing season was paradoxically the time when culture deepened, when you learned to sing, to carve, or to play games, not for entertainment, but simply to outlast the oppressive darkness. Specialists continue to disagree on whether medieval winters were truly harder on the human body, or merely different in their essential rhythm. Some argue that the significant reduction in hard labor saved precious strength, balancing the metabolic hardship of the cold. Others point to the undeniable scarcity of food and fuel, arguing that this made the season far more punishing, a brutal filter that shortened lifespans. The truth may lie in the sheer unevenness of it all. Some households feasted and rested, while others starved and shivered, their fate decided by the brutal lottery of harvests, lords, and sheer luck. You picture yourself now, sitting at the hearth in the late afternoon. The sky outside is already bruised with dusk, and the evening supper is bubbling slowly in a single, heavy pot. Everyone eats earlier in winter, not just because the darkness comes so fast, but because there is precious little else to do once the rushlights begin to gutter and fade. The evening stretches before you, a vast, uncharted territory of time. You wrap a heavy blanket around your shoulders and settle in for the slow commerce of tales told in hushed, reverent voices. A neighbor shares news he heard from a traveler from another village. A child recites a simple rhyme learned from her grandmother. Someone begins to hum a tune older than anyone's memory. Festivals, too, would punctuate the long season. Yuletide feasts, or the revelry of carnival, brought moments of riotous, defiant joy into the otherwise heavy rhythm. Families would save their best, driest wood for these nights, letting the fire blaze brighter and hotter, cooking extra meat and inviting a warmth into their hearts as much as into their bones. For one fleeting, magical night, the cold was forgotten, replaced by the dance of shadows and the rich, savoury smell of roasting fat. And still, the season shaped the very nature of sleep itself. People often went to bed soon after dark, only to wake again in the deep, silent middle of the night. This was the first sleep. They would then lie awake for an hour or so, perhaps chatting quietly with a bedfellow, before drifting into a second sleep that would last until dawn. This segmented rhythm fit the winter far better, when the endless hours of darkness were simply too long for one unbroken period of rest. You imagine yourself waking in the still heart of the night, feeding the hearth, whispering to a companion, and then curling back under the covers until the pale light of morning. The air smells of wool and smoke, a scent that is heavy and deeply familiar. You stretch your feet toward the fire, sighing as the gentle warmth soothes your toes. It is then you realize that winter is not just endured, it is patterned, its demands woven deeply into the fabric of work, rest, food, and prayer. Life bends to the cold because it must. As the night deepens, you can hear the distant howl of the wind against the shutters, the low snort of livestock shifting in the nearby shed. Yet inside, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of these winter days, you feel a strange sense of contentment. The world has slowed, it has narrowed, but in that very narrowing lies a new kind of focus. Survival here is not frantic, but deliberate. Every act is measured, every ember is watched, and as you drift towards sleep, you understand that the medieval winters were not simply months of abject suffering. They were months of profound adaptation, of finding meaning in the slowness, and of shaping a resilient community against the vast, silent backdrop of the frost. The rhythm of winter days is heavy, a relentless, grinding weight of cold and dark. But sometimes, the season itself offers a reprieve, a moment of pure, unexpected grace. Imagine stepping outside one morning to find not the familiar misery, but an astonishing marvel. A river, once flowing and alive, now frozen solid, its surface as hard and polished as dark glass, stretching wide and silent beneath a pale winter sky. Word spreads through the village like a spark in dry tinder, and by the afternoon, the riverbanks are thronged with people. Merchants, children, and curious travellers all tread boldly out onto the impossible ice. A frost fair has begun, a rare and joyous celebration where winter itself, the great antagonist, becomes the stage. Chroniclers in England describe these fairs vividly during the later Middle Ages, especially on the great River Thames, when unusually severe cold spells would lock it in a grip of ice for weeks on end. Stalls, built hastily from timber and scraps of cloth, would spring up almost overnight, selling hot food, spiced drinks, and simple trinkets. Great bonfires would be lit directly on the frozen surface, their smoke curling lazily into the crisp, clean air, while people laughed at the sheer, glorious absurdity of living and celebrating atop what should be moving water. For a season defined by unrelenting scarcity, these fairs were sudden, miraculous bursts of abundance and joy. One detail that feels almost comic in its audacity. Vendors would sometimes roast entire sides of meat or brew casks of ale right there on the ice. Imagine the defiant courage of setting a great fire atop frozen water, placing your complete trust in the thickness of the frost to hold. Contemporary reports describe the ice trembling and groaning with deep cracks, yet the revelry continued, the people choosing merriment over fear. Children, bundled in thick wool, skated clumsily on polished animal bones strapped to their shoes. Dogs bounded wildly across the strange new playground, and jugglers performed for the crowds, their hands somehow nimble despite the bitter air. Not all scholars agree on how widespread or frequent these incredible festivals truly were. Some argue they were rare anomalies, limited to the unusually harsh winters that marked the period known as the Little Ice Age. Others suggest that smaller, more local versions of these fairs occurred more often than we realize, their traces simply lost to history because they were so informal and temporary. The debate lingers in fragmentary accounts and local legends, but whether they were occasional or common, the very memory of a frost fair captures something essential: the stubborn, human refusal to let winter win entirely. You step out onto the ice now, the frozen surface creaking faintly under your weight. A low, resonant sound. The air rings with the sounds of laughter and shouts, and the warm, sweet smell of roasted chestnuts mingles with the sharper tang of wood smoke. A lone fiddler plays a lively tune while couples dance with a careful, shuffling grace, their heavy cloaks spinning as their breath clouds and mingles around them. For once, no one seems worried about the cold. It has become a part of the spectacle, a shared, silent joke between the villagers and the season itself. Children rush past, their cheeks flushed a bright, healthy red, holding sticks tipped with colourful ribbons. Merchants hawk hot gingerbread shaped into the forms of animals, their voices booming across the vast, frozen expanse. Somewhere, a man slides heavy mugs of ale across a makeshift wooden table, the dark froth sloshing as the drink itself threatens to freeze. Dogs bark, and a flock of geese honks indignantly at their impossibly solid pond. And everywhere, people press closer to the miraculous flames built upon the ice, marveling that they can even exist at all. The joy is utterly contagious. You find yourself grinning from ear to ear, despite your stiff fingers, despite the familiar numbness creeping into your toes. For these few precious hours, winter feels less like an enemy and more like a willing conspirator in a grand, delightful game. Even the inherent dangers, the groaning ice, the sudden, sharp cracks that echo across the river, only add to the thrill. People let out a collective cheer when a loud snap rings out, then laugh with a nervous energy, adjusting their steps but steadfastly refusing to retreat to the safety of the bank. As twilight begins to fall, the fair grows even more magical. Torches are lit, their flickering flames casting long, dancing reflections on the glassy surface. The air hums with song, mugs clink in toasts, and shadows leap and play across the makeshift stalls. You breathe in deeply, the cold, pure air filling your lungs. But instead of the usual dread, you feel a profound sense of exhilaration. Winter, in its immense power, has given you a gift, an unexpected, unforgettable festival carved from frost itself. When at last you leave, trudging back to your smoky cottage, your body is weary, but your spirit is strangely, wonderfully light. You know the cold will gnaw at you again tomorrow, that the familiar companions of hunger and smoke will return. But tonight, you carry with you the memory of laughter on ice. In the long, hard war with winter, moments like these are victories fleeting, fragile, but absolutely unforgettable. The memory of shared laughter on the frozen river begins to fade, dissipating like steam in the frigid air as the night draws its dark cloak in once again. You sit by the glowing embers, the world outside now profoundly quiet, and a deep realization settles upon you. For many in this world, warmth was never only a physical sensation. When the firewood dwindled and the drafts grew bold, people turned to stories, to charms, and to whispered protections, believing with all their hearts that unseen forces could shield them from the merciless bite of the cold. Winter, after all, was not just an enemy of the body. It was a true test of the spirit. Parish records and the rich tapestry of folklore collections reveal that small charms against the chill were woven deeply into the fabric of everyday life. By the hearth, families would mutter quiet prayers, invoking the aid of saints to keep the precious flames alive through the night. Saint Blaise, Saint Lawrence, or even Saint Bridget were called upon, their holy names stitched into the very fabric of nightly chants meant to keep the embers glowing until morning. In parts of Ireland, intricate crosses woven from straw were hung over doorways, a simple, powerful blessing thought to guard the house against the creeping tendrils of the frost. These quiet practices were less about trying to change the weather, and more about reassuring the soul that one was not fighting the great cold entirely alone. And here is one of those curious, wonderful threads in the fabric of ancient superstition. Some households firmly believed that throwing a single pinch of salt into the fire would chase away not only evil spirits, but also the physical presence of the cold itself. In some German villages, it was custom to sprinkle a little ale into the hearth as a solemn offering, a small, hopeful sacrifice intended to keep the warmth steady and strong. Imagine crouching by the fire, your voice a low mutter as you toss a crumb of bread or a splash of your drink into the flames, engaged in a silent, desperate bargain with the unseen world to let your family survive just one more night. Scholars, of course, still debate how literally such beliefs were held. Some argue they were largely symbolic, a ritualistic way of layering deeper meaning onto routine, but vital chores like banking the fire. Others insist that people genuinely feared a supernatural cold, that they believed in malevolent spirits of winter, in witches who could steal the very heat from a hearth fire, or in demons that rode upon the howling north wind. The world of folklore hopelessly, beautifully blurs the line between earnest faith and ingrained practice, and it may never be clear whether these rituals were acts of deep belief or simply habits passed down through the uncounted generations. You watch now as a villager whispers over their hearth, their fingers tracing the sign of a cross in the smoky air. The children look on, their eyes wide sources of belief in the flickering light, clutching each other as a sudden shower of sparks leaps up. A charm is spoken, but softly, not shouted, because it was understood that magic is always more powerful when it sounds like a secret. For a brief suspended moment, everyone in the room allows themselves to believe that the fire has actually grown stronger, the room a little warmer. You feel it too, a psychological comfort, though your reason tells you it is only the cold finally catching up to the small flame. Legends would swirl in the smoky air of taverns and be shared on frozen winter roads. There were tales of travellers lost in blinding snowstorms, who survived only because a kindly saint appeared before them with a lantern of eternal, unquenchable flame. There were darker stories, of witches who could exhale a soul-stealing frost through keyholes, draining the warmth from sleeping families. Old men would swear on their lives that they had seen frost sprites tapping at the shutters, their sharp nails like brittle icicles. These tales would make the children squeal and the adults smile with a weary knowingness, but they also reveal a fundamental truth. When survival itself is fragile, the human imagination becomes another essential tool. You lean back, listening as a neighbour begins to recount a local tale of a miraculous fire in the marsh that never, ever went out, guarded by a kindly spirit. Everyone in the room nods solemnly, as if the story itself carries and imparts warmth. In its telling, the flicker of the flames on your own hearth seems to grow brighter, the smoke a little less harsh. For a brief, powerful while, belief itself becomes an insulation, wrapping the heart in something far stronger and more comforting than wool. The night deepens, the wind clawing at the shutters, but inside the small cottage, the room is hushed, utterly spellbound by the story. A child yawns, curling close to her mother, a faint smudge of soot on her cheek. Someone gently stirs the fire, and the embers leap, showering the hearth with sparks like a cascade of tiny, fleeting stars. No one says it aloud, but everyone is grateful for the charm that now lingers in the air, whether it came from a pinch of salt, a whispered prayer, or the simple, powerful act of storytelling. You close your eyes, the quiet words of ancient blessings still echoing faintly in your mind, and you realize that medieval warmth was never just about logs and embers. It was also about belief, woven into prayers, charms, and the legends that sustained them. When the cold pressed its hardest, people reached not only for more fuel, but for faith, for magic, and for the desperate, beautiful hope that something unseen might stand with them against the frost. The gentle echo of last night's stories, of charms and protective spirits, still lingers in your ears as you wake the next morning to an entirely different and far harsher sound. The sharp, wet sniffles and the ragged, chesty coughs of those around you. Winter did not just freeze bodies, it unsettled them from within. And in the minds of medieval physicians, the cold air itself was a malevolent force, carrying dangers that went far beyond mere discomfort. The medical treatises from the period, especially those deeply influenced by ancient Galenic theory, stressed that the four humours of the body, the vital fluids of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile could be thrown into a state of dangerous chaos by prolonged exposure to the chill. Cold and damp, the learned physicians warned, encouraged the humour of phlegm to dominate, leading to a cascade of winter ailments, persistent coughs, lingering fevers, and the dreaded state of melancholy. The body, very much like the hearth at the centre of the home, was seen as an internal furnace. If the living flame inside grew too weak, a perilous imbalance would surely follow. And here is a peculiar and wonderful practice born directly from this belief. People would sometimes carry small sachets of dried herbs, sage, rosemary, lavender, which they would press close to their noses as they walked, hoping that the warm, dry scents of the plants would actively counteract the dangerous, invisible influence of the cold, damp air. In Italy, physicians would prescribe cloves or nutmeg to be chewed throughout the day. These potent spices, seen as tiny, ingestible sparks of inner fire, meant to keep the humours in their proper, delicate balance. Imagine yourself shivering in the relentless wind while biting down on a pungent, numbing clove, utterly convinced that its sharp perfume would keep both the frost and the illness at bay. Scholars today remain divided over whether these practices were rooted more in sincere medical theory or in simple, comforting habit. Some argue that physicians of the time genuinely believed in cold air as a physical vector of imbalance, a true medical threat. Others suggest that many of these recommendations were largely symbolic, a way of comforting anxious patients with rituals that provided a powerful psychological warmth, even if their physical effect was negligible. The lack of precise records from the era leaves the question open, though the sheer persistence of these remedies hints at how strongly people must have trusted in them. You sit by the hearth now, listening as a neighbour describes his rattling cough. He insists with absolute certainty that it began the night he walked in the wind without his cloak, and everyone around the fire nods with solemn, shared understanding. Another person recounts the story of a child who was said to have let the frost into her chest, and immediately remedies are exchanged like precious coins. Garlic boiled in milk to purify the lungs, wine mulled with hot spices to ignite the blood, even the simple act of sitting close to a brazier while wrapped tightly in a cocoon of blankets. The cures offered are as much about the application of heat as they are about medicine. The rich, fragrant smell of spiced wine begins to fill the room as someone prepares just such a remedy. Cloves and sticks of cinnamon simmer in the pot, releasing a warm, fragrant steam into the air. You take a tentative sip, and the liquid burns pleasantly as it goes down, a tangible heat spreading from your tongue down into the very center of your chest. For a moment you feel almost completely convinced that the cold itself is being physically driven away, replaced by the internal fire of the spices. Whether it is medicine or merely comfort, you do not care. It works, at least for now. In the monasteries, the infirmaries would echo with similar sounds. Monks coughing in their cots, the purifying scent of rosemary smouldering in bowls to cleanse the air, and physicians lecturing on the specific dangers of the north winds, which were believed to bring not just a chill but actual disease. Herbal remedies are measured and administered with a grave solemnity, but beneath all the ancient ritual lies the same fundamental truth you feel at home. Heat is health, cold is peril. The fear of melancholy, too, seeps into the winter conversations. People whisper that the long, oppressive darkness brings a sadness that is more than just a mood. It is a true humoral imbalance, the body flooded with an excess of black bile. To sit for too long by a dying fire, they say, is to invite melancholy to take hold of your soul. You realize that in winter, even your spirit is considered vulnerable, your mood as fragile as your own visible breath. You watch as a woman tosses a handful of dried herbs into the hearth, muttering a quiet blessing as the fragrant smoke rises. She breathes it in deeply, convinced that the warm, pungent fragrance will guard her family from harm. The children, watching her, imitate the ritual, holding small sprigs of herbs to their own noses, giggling at the sharp, clean scent. The ritual binds them together, an act of belief as much as one of medicine, a different kind of warmth woven from both fire and faith. And as the night settles in once again, you lie beneath your heavy blankets, your chest still glowing faintly from the spiced wine. you realize that the concept of warmth in this world is so much more than just firewood, peat, or coal. It is also the deep conviction that the heat held inside you, whether from food, from drink, or from your own unwavering spirit, is what protects you against the endless dangers of winter. In a time when science and superstition mingled so freely, the very line between health and warmth was beautifully, hopefully blurred. And perhaps that, in itself, was its own kind of cure. The lingering glow of the spiced wine still warms your chest, a pleasant internal ember. But now, your eyes drift across the room, taking in the house itself. You begin to realize that warmth in this world wasn't only a fleeting matter of fire or clothing. It was built, with quiet intention, into the very bones of medieval homes, shaped by an architecture that tried, in its own uneven and often desperate way, to keep the great cold at bay. Archaeological studies of surviving manors and humble cottages reveal that medieval builders knew the cold intimately, as a personal and relentless enemy. They thickened walls with insulating layers of stone or packed earth. They designed low ceilings to trap any rising heat, and they built small, narrow doorways that let in less of the biting wind. Even the very placement of houses within a village sometimes served in the great fight against the frost. Dwellings were clustered close together, their roofs angled to shield one another like a group of neighbors huddling together for mutual protection. What seems to us now as merely quaint or impossibly cramped was, in fact, a deliberate strategy for survival. Every timber, every joint, every gentle curve was built with the singular thought of endurance in mind. And here's one of those intriguing architectural quirks. Some cottages had primitive smoke hoods or canopies built of wood and plaster above the open hearth, crudely funneling the smoke upward without the cost or sophistication of a full chimney. These early contraptions were anything but elegant, but they directed just enough of the smoke to make sitting near the fire a tolerable, if still eye-watering experience. Imagine crouching under a rough wooden canopy while the flames snapped just beneath, the hood capturing most of the choking haze so your eyes didn't burn with every single breath. Researchers, however, continue to argue about how much these designs truly insulated the inhabitants. Some believe that even thick stone walls, though imposing, stored the cold just as easily as they stored heat, making the interiors little warmer than the outside air. Others suggest that the careful combination of thick walls, low ceilings, and heavy fabric hangings created enough of a thermal buffer to make survival significantly easier. The truth is probably mixed and messy. The very same wall that radiated a comforting warmth after hours of a blazing fire could just as easily leach that heat back out overnight if the embers were not carefully tended. You step into a cottage now, ducking low under the doorway. The ceiling is so low that you nearly brush it with your head, and immediately the space feels snug, compressed, as though the room itself is trying to give its inhabitants a gentle hug. The walls are rough to the touch, but their sheer thickness visibly muffles some of the howling outside wind. You notice again how the hearth is set into the central floor, the smoke guided up into the rafters, blackening the beams but leaving just enough clear air below for people to live and breathe. Every single detail whispers of compromise. Nothing is perfect, but everything is practical. In larger homes, the architecture showed this same constant tension. Castles, with their massive, impenetrable stone walls, looked invincible from the outside, but inside, they trapped the cold like great, echoing caverns. Lords and ladies fought this by building smaller, more intimate chambers within the larger structure, layering them with expensive tapestries and narrowing the windows to mere defensive slits. Kitchens were often strategically tucked near the great hall, so that the immense heat of the ovens could seep through the stone into the surrounding rooms. Spiral staircases would often hug the great fireplaces, carrying a column of rising warmth upward through the otherwise frigid towers. These details did not erase the cold, but they bent it, softened it, and wrestled it into something that was, just barely, survivable. The smells of these places tell their own story of the battle. Damp stone carries a sharp, earthy tang. The ancient wooden beams exude the pungent sharpness of smoke that has soaked deep into their grain over centuries. The rush mats on the floor smell faintly of mold and of the fragrant herbs that were scattered over them and replaced each season to freshen the air. Even the ceilings have their own unique perfume, a mixture of soot, tar, and the lingering memory of countless fires. You realized that warmth in this world wasn't only something you felt on your skin, it was something you could smell, a complex olfactory signature of a house that had endured many, many winters. Outside, you notice how the entire village seems to be arranged for endurance. The houses cluster tight against one another. Barns and byres are pressed close so that the animals' body warmth contributes to the overall survival of the humans. Narrow, winding lanes are designed to block the wind, and fences of woven brush are built to catch the drifting snow. The architecture here wasn't just about walls. It was a form of choreography, an entire layout meticulously designed to keep the frost from ruling unchallenged. Of course, not every design worked flawlessly. Roofs inevitably leaked, shutters rattled incessantly, smoke hoods failed, and the cold seeped through every unsealed seam. Fire hazards lurked in every dry thatch, and a single stray ember on a windy night could undo a generation's worth of work in a matter of minutes. Yet, people kept building, kept repairing, and kept adapting. Survival was never about perfection. It was about persistence. At night, lying under the low rafters, you notice how profoundly different this space feels compared to a nobleman's great hall. Here, the ceiling presses down gently, a comforting weight that holds in what little heat the hearth provides. The room smells of wool drying, of stew simmering, of the smoke hanging thick and heavy in the air. But you are grateful. It is warmer in here than it is outside, and in the dead of winter, that simple difference matters more than any amount of grandeur. Somewhere in the village, a hammer rings faintly in the cold air as someone repairs a broken shutter, determined to seal a draft before the next storm arrives. In another house, fresh dung is being plastered into a crack in the wall, its earthy smell quietly accepted as the price of warmth. Architecture here is not beauty for beauty's sake. It is survival, rendered in timber and clay, stone and smoke. Each house is a handmade shield against the season, and as you close your eyes beneath those dark, soot-stained beams, you understand that warmth wasn't found only in fires or fabrics. It was baked into the very design of the spaces people lived in, the quiet, desperate ingenuity of builders who shaped walls and ceilings into weapons against the winter. Imperfect, smoky, fragile, but enough. It was always just enough. The memory of the cottage's thick, earthy walls begins to fade as your mind conjures a different setting entirely. The looming silhouette of a castle, its cold stone towers cutting jaggedly into the grey winter sky. From a distance, it looks impregnable, a fortress built to withstand every imaginable threat. But step inside during the frozen depths of January, and that illusion crumbles. The stone does not repel the cold. It absorbs it, hoards it, and magnifies it. Even the great lords, for all their power and wealth, could not escape the winter's chilling bite. Castle inventories and surviving architectural features all tell the same story. Though vast, roaring fires blazed in the great halls, most of the private chambers remained frigid. The thick walls, sometimes 10 feet across, stored the chill of the night just as well as they stored the heat of the day. Drafty arrow slits, designed for defense, let the icy air creep through relentlessly. The lords and ladies of these mighty strongholds would layer themselves in heavy fur and wool, draping thick cloaks over their shoulders even while sitting indoors. Servants scurried in an endless, weary procession with heavy bundles of logs, feeding enormous fireplaces that burned with far more spectacle than actual efficiency. And here is an odd, telling detail of castle life. The castle latrines, known as garderobes, often doubled as makeshift wardrobes. Why? Because the clothes stored near these open, drafty shafts would absorb the constant flow of cold air, which supposedly deterred moths from chewing holes in the precious fabric. Imagine stepping into a cold stone shaft of a chamber on a winter morning, shivering uncontrollably while changing your garments, and telling yourself, well, at least the moths are gone. Even in the midst of grandeur, the compromises were constant. Historians remain divided over how much true comfort castles really offered. Some argue that with their multiple hearths, thick wall hangings, and carefully placed chambers, the nobles lived in relative warmth compared to the peasants in their huts. Others counter that even kings complained bitterly of icy draughts, and that all the tapestries and braziers in the world did little more than soften the edges of a profound and inescapable misery. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The lords had more layers of defense against the cold, but they never truly conquered it. You walk now into the great hall of such a fortress. A fire blazes at the far end, set within a grand fireplace as tall as a man, its carved stone mantle blackened by years of smoke. Sparks leap, flames roar with a hungry sound. And yet, the moment you step away from its immediate circle of heat, your breath immediately clouds the air. The opposite wall is visibly rimmed with frost, its great stones slick with condensation. Servants cluster close to the fire, pretending to be busy polishing goblets, while in truth they are simply trying to thaw their frozen hands. Upstairs, the private chambers are colder still. A noble woman sits near a small, glowing brazier, her gown lined with soft fur, her hands tucked deep into a muff. She laughs with her ladies-in-waiting, but her cheeks are flushed, not from comfort, but from the biting chill. Behind her, the walls are hung with richly woven tapestries, knights and saints depicted in brilliant thread. They serve as decoration, yes, but their primary purpose here is insulation against the relentless cold that radiates from the stones. The smell of burning wood follows you everywhere. Great logs of oak and beech are carted in by the wagon load, consumed with an endless hunger by the fireplaces that are never allowed to rest. You hear the servants mutter about the relentless pace of cutting and hauling, knowing that even a lord's vast forest might dwindle quickly in a particularly harsh winter. In some historical accounts, entire villages were tasked with keeping the castle hearth supplied, their own small fires shrinking while the fortress blazed. Night falls, and you wander the long, echoing corridors. The torches in their sconces sputter, their small flames bending and dancing in the constant draught. You clutch your cloak tighter, your footsteps echoing against walls that feel more like the inside of a tomb than a home. In a distant chamber, you hear a child crying from the cold, and a nurse muttering quiet comforts as she tucks another heavy blanket around the little body. Power, you realize, cannot erase the winter. It can only buy a few more layers, a few more logs, a few more servants to feed the insatiable flames. Still, there is a strange and stubborn majesty in this endurance. The castles stood not only as defences against human invaders, but as great monuments to human stubbornness against nature itself. Their stones loomed through centuries of frost, housing generations of people who endured by layering fabrics, hanging tapestries, feeding braziers, and telling themselves that strength resided in these very walls. Even if their toes were numb and their breaths were visible, they believed that the fortress stood as living proof that survival was possible. You sit finally in a small, forgotten chamber, a single candle burning weakly against the dark, and you pull your cloak ever closer. The great fire in the hall is too far away to reach you now, and the brazier here has long since gone out. The stone presses in on all sides, indifferent and cold, yet you find yourself smiling a wry, knowing smile. If even the lords and kings shivered through the long winter nights, then perhaps there is a strange comfort in that shared truth. Winter humbled everyone, no matter their title, and so you lie down on a stiff, cold mattress, your breath misting in the air, the walls around you groaning with the immense weight of the frost. The castle may tower over the fields and rivers, a symbol of power, but tonight, within its very bones, you feel no different from the peasant in his humble, dung-plastered cottage. In the face of a true winter, power bends, pride freezes, and every single ember matters. The castle's echoing, monumental chill seems to linger in your very bones. But as the first pale light of dawn creeps over the village, you hear something else entirely. Not the groan of stone, but voices close and warm, rising in shared laughter despite the frost. You step into the tight cluster of cottages, and you immediately see why. When the nights grew harshest, when even the firewood began to dwindle and the last embers dimmed, neighbours turned not only to their own hearths, but to one another. Manorial records and the persistent threads of oral tradition remind us that winter was rarely endured alone. Families shared what little fuel they had, they borrowed precious embers from one another, and they sometimes even split their meagre meals when scarcity pressed its hardest. A hearth was not just private property, it was a resource that was woven deeply into the social fabric of the entire community. People survived less because of their thick walls, and more because of a shared warmth, both literal and figurative. There is a striking little custom preserved in scattered village accounts from the period. When a household's fire died out completely, a child was often sent to a neighbour's cottage, carrying a small covered pot or a clay jar on an errand to fetch a living coal. This errand was never seen as shameful. It was simply expected. A single flame, passed from one hearth to another, was like a lifeline, a glowing thread that bound the homes together. Imagine that child, trudging through the deep snow, clutching a small pot wrapped in wool, guarding that single glowing ember as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Scholars still argue about how far this powerful solidarity truly stretched. Some suggest it was a universal instinct, the natural response of villages everywhere to share fuel and stories when their collective survival was at stake. Others point to the grim evidence of theft, of bitter quarrels, and of harsh accusations when woodpiles or peat stacks went missing, suggesting that raw desperation sometimes outweighed the spirit of community. Both can be true, of course. The winter could inspire profound generosity on one night and deep suspicion the next. Survival was never a purely noble affair. You watch now as a group of neighbours gather around a single brazier in the centre of a small cottage. A woman pours thin, warm ale into mugs, the steam rising faintly as the children press close to the comforting glow. The air is thick with smoke, with lively chatter, and with the unmistakable smell of damp wool slowly drying. Jokes are shared, complaints are voiced, and someone begins to tell a story from years past. A winter when the snow lay so deep that the roofs of several cottages collapsed under its immense weight. The laughter that follows this grim tale feels warmer and more vital than the fire itself. The sounds of the gathering begin to blur into a general sense of comfort. The clinking of mugs, a dog barking softly under the table, a baby fussing until it is soothed by its mother's gentle hum. You realize that what truly heats this room is not just the fire, but the fellowship. The cold outside may be relentless, but within these four humble walls, the people are manufacturing their own, warmer season one of chatter, companionship, and a fragile shared security. In the poorest villages, this solidarity was sometimes even more dramatic. Entire families might choose to sleep in a single cottage during the harshest spells of weather, pooling their blankets, their livestock, and what little fuel they had. The space would grow unbearably crowded, but the mass of bodies pressed together could mean the difference between shivering through the night and freezing to death. To live through a medieval winter was often to surrender the very idea of privacy, to accept that survival demanded an uncomfortable but life-giving closeness. You picture yourself now, leaning in as an elder shares a folk tale, his voice rasping like the crackle of the fire itself. Children gasp and giggle at the tale's fantastic twists, while the adults nod knowingly at its ancient lessons. The story itself becomes another kind of ember, carried from a voice to an ear, passed along like a living flame in the great darkness. By the time it is over, you are not just warmer, you are steadier, more certain that you too will endure. Yet there were moments of tension as well. When the food grew scarce and the fuel began to dwindle, neighbours would watch one another carefully. A missing log from a woodpile might spark a dark suspicion. A vanished peat brick, a bitter argument. The very same closeness that bred such powerful solidarity could just as easily breed a quiet resentment. Winter tested not only the resilience of the body, but also the delicate bonds between people. Still, more often than not, you find the sound of laughter was louder than the sound of quarrels. The simple knowledge that others endured the same frost, the same smoke-filled rooms, the same rattling coughs and stiff, aching joints, this somehow made the burden lighter. Misery shared was misery halved. As the long evening stretches on, someone begins to sing softly, a lullaby more than a song, the gentle notes curling like smoke up toward the blackened rafters. The conversation dwindles, the mugs are emptied, and the blankets are drawn tighter. The fire sinks low, but the hearts in the room remain a little warmer for the time that was spent together. You walk home through the silent snow, your own breath misting in the dark, and you carry with you more than just a lingering heat. You carry the certainty that in the medieval winter, survival was never an individual achievement. It was a communal act, a patchwork quilt sewn together from countless small kindnesses, An ember given, a story shared, a place at the fire offered when the night was at its longest. By the time you crawl back into your own straw bed, the lesson lingers. Winter pressed hard, but human warmth messy, noisy, and generous pressed back. And that, more than any wood or peat, was what kept the frost from winning. The echoes of that neighbourly laughter trail off behind you as you climb the gentle rise toward the parish church. Its stone tower looms against the pale sky, its bells silent, its great doors closed against the wind. Yet as you push them open, you feel something unusual. Not warmth, exactly, but a gentler, less aggressive cold. The church, built of massive stone just like a castle, should be an icy, echoing cavern. Instead, the air within seems softer, somehow tempered by centuries of ritual and the faint, lingering presence of humanity. Church records and architectural surveys tell us that most medieval churches were not heated in the modern sense. Open fires were often strictly forbidden in the main sanctuaries, for fear of smoke damage and the ever-present risk of a catastrophic blaze. The vast stone naves remained as cold as the grave. Worshippers would shiver through the long masses, their cloaks wrapped tight around them, their own breath fogging in the frigid air. Yet, even the churches had their own quiet ways of pushing back the winter. Their thick walls trapped not just the sound of prayer, but also the faint, cumulative warmth of crowded bodies. And in the small side chapels or the vestries, braziers were sometimes kept discreetly tucked away. Here is a curious practice, recorded in several different regions. Parishioners would sometimes bring small hand warmers, or even hot stones wrapped in cloth to the long services, hiding them under their cloaks as they prayed. The wealthier congregants might even hire a servant to hold a brazier nearby, shielding their master from the worst of the draughts that swept through the nave. Imagine the rows of villagers, kneeling on the hard stone floors, each one secretly clutching a warm rock, their deep faith mingling with the most practical of comforts. Historians still debate whether the great cathedrals were simply endured as magnificent, icy monuments, or whether more creative heating solutions were quietly employed. Some evidence suggests that during major feasts like Christmas, great torches and vast numbers of candles were lit in such quantities that their combined heat would raise the temperature noticeably. Others argue this was mere wishful thinking, that no amount of burning wax could ever truly soften the profound chill of such vast, open spaces. Standing here now, the cold pressing into your bones, you suspect both views are partly true. Enough candles to make the space glow like a constellation of stars, but not nearly enough to thaw your frozen feet. You shuffle toward a side chapel where a single brazier smoulders faintly. The holy smell of incense mixes with the acrid tang of burning charcoal, creating a hazy atmosphere that is both sacred and earthly. A monk quietly tends to the coals, adding a few chips of dried resin that pop and release a fragrant, cleansing smoke. You extend your hands discreetly, letting the gentle warmth brush against your fingertips. All around you, worshippers murmur their prayers, their voices soft but steady, weaving a quiet rhythm that helps to distract from the ever-present cold. The architecture itself plays tricks on the perception. Sunlight, filtering through the vibrant stained glass, splashes brilliant patches of color across the floor. The very brilliance of the light, the deep reds and the glowing golds, makes the space feel warmer, even though the air itself is still sharp. It is a medieval psychology of warmth, built into the very walls of the building. You notice how the villagers are clustered together in the pews, their cloaks overlapping, small children nestled against their parents, sharing body heat while the priest intones the Latin Mass. The great organ wheezes faintly, its pipes stiff with the frost, but the music rises like a great collective breath, filling the nave with a sound that feels warm and alive. Even in the bitterest cold, the ritual itself provides its own kind of insulation, the comfort of repetition, of community, of shared belief. For an hour, you forget the draughts that creep through the cracks in the stone, the great walls that leach the heat from your body. The great festivals made the church warmer still, not by fire, but by the sheer force of numbers. On Christmas Eve or Candlemas, hundreds of people would crowd shoulder to shoulder, their collective body heat finally beginning to shift the thermal balance. The air would grow thick and heavy, pungent with the mingled smells of sweat, damp wool, and incense. It was not comfortable, by any means, but it was survivable. And in that close, shared experience, people felt a strange and powerful joy. The church became not just a place of worship, but a place where winter itself seemed less hostile, its vicious bite dulled by the presence of bodies and the power of song. Outside, the great bells finally toll, their deep, resonant sound carrying for miles through the crisp, clear air. You pull your cloak tight as you step back out into the snow, but something from the church lingers with you. It did not truly warm your body, but it steadied your soul. Its great walls offered a physical shelter from the wind. Its ancient rituals wove a thread of meaning into the cold, dark days, and its community made the frost feel less lonely. Later, you think of the countless winters when entire villages trudged to this place, their boots crunching in the snow, their faces raw from the wind, drawn not just by their faith, but by the simple, powerful promise of togetherness. The fire may not have blazed within its walls, but the human spirit did. And in the end, that was its own form of heat. As night falls, you sit by your own hearth again, remembering the warm glow of the candles, the quiet murmur of the chanted prayers, the faint, stolen touch of warmth in the side chapel. You realize that survival in this world was not measured only in logs and embers. Sometimes, it was measured in voices raised together, in the beauty of colored light, and in the stubborn, unyielding faith that the cold could not and would not conquer the soul. The memory of colored glass and holy incense still lingers as you step away from the church, back into the profound silence of the deep winter night. The stars glint overhead like chips of ice, cold and merciless, and the frozen ground crunches with every single step. You realize now that across the villages, the towns, the monasteries, and the castles, people have fought this same great enemy in 1,000 endless variations. But here, as our long journey draws toward its end, you finally begin to see the pattern. Survival in this world was always a patchwork quilt, stitched together from the essential threads of fire, fabric, faith, and fellowship. Contemporary chronicles and the silent testimony of archaeological remains all confirm that no single method was ever enough. The hearth smoked, but it gave light. The braziers warmed, but they threatened suffocation. The tapestries softened the cold stone, but they never truly banished the draughts. Coal burned hot, but it fouled the air. Peat smouldered steadily, but it left houses choking in a tarry haze. Every choice carried its price, and yet people balanced these compromises daily, trading smoke for warmth, risk for comfort, scarcity for endurance. And here is a striking, powerful image, preserved in folklore and the fragmentary diaries of the age. People sometimes spoke of winter as a living creature, a great white wolf pressing at the door, or a silent giant crouching on the roof. In turn, they described the fire as a loyal, living guardian, an ember-fed sentry holding the great beast at bay. To bank the coals carefully each night was to arm that guardian, to give it just enough strength to continue its fight until the dawn. Imagine leaning over your own hearth, whispering words of encouragement into the dying embers, as though the very flame could hear and obey you. Scholars today continue to wrestle with just how harsh the medieval winters truly were. Some argue that great climate shifts, like the period known as the Little Ice Age, exaggerated the suffering, making the 15th and 16th centuries crueler than the earlier medieval times. Others insist that endurance was always a relative concept. A peasant shivering in the 11th century felt the cold just as fiercely as one shivering in the 14th. Regardless of the recorded temperatures, the academic debate may never be truly settled, but the human reality remains starkly clear. The cold was an unchanging, elemental fact, and survival demanded an unending, desperate ingenuity. You sit now by the hearth one final time, your hands outstretched to its gentle, fading glow. Around you, in your mind's eye, all the images of the past weeks rise together in a silent chorus. The peasant cottage, patched with dung, the smoke stinging your eyes. The great noble hall, roaring with spectacle, yet leaving your back icy cold. The monastery cloister, silent and punishing, where the cold itself was a form of prayer. The bathhouse, steaming with blessed relief, laughter echoing through the warm mist. The frost fair on the river, children skating on polished bones, fires burning miraculously atop the solid ice. The neighbour's gift of embers, carried so carefully in a small pot across the snow, the charm whispered over the flames, the sachet of herbs pressed to the nose, the spiced wine burning its warm path down to your chest. Each of these fragments, viewed alone, is fragile, almost insignificant, but together they weave a magnificent, resilient tapestry of survival. This is the story of how human beings met the deepest cold, not with the expectation of comfort, but with an abundance of courage. You think of the countless, unnamed men, women, and children who endured those drafty nights, who woke up stiff and coughing, but who still rose to cut wood, to fetch peat, or to tend to their animals. You can see their breath in the frosty air, their cloaks stiff with snow, their laughter ringing out through the smoky rooms. They did not defeat the winter, but they endured it, and that endurance in itself became their greatest triumph. The room grows quieter now as the fire sinks low. You lie back on your straw pallet, the heavy weight of wool pressing down against your shoulders, the familiar scent of wood smoke curling into your hair. Your body is tired, but your heart is steady. For now, the single ember in the heart of the hearth still glows, its faint red pulse a constant, living reminder that even in the darkest and coldest of seasons, warmth can be coaxed into being. You let your eyes close, and the world narrows to the gentle crackle of cooling ash, the distant murmur of the wind, and the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breath. The medieval winters were harsh, relentless, and unforgiving, but they also shaped a profound resilience, a desperate inventiveness, and a stubborn, beautiful refusal to give in. Every ember, every story, every shared blanket was living proof that people could carve out a life for themselves against the very coldest of odds. And so you drift into sleep, surrounded by centuries of this quiet survival, carried on a gentle tide of smoke and shadow. Winter waits outside, but here, within, you are warm enough. You are warm enough to dream. And now, as our long story finally closes, the very fire in your mind seems to soften. The crackle grows gentler, the glow dims to a faint, pulsing red, and the room fills with a deep and comfortable hush that feels like safety. You breathe deeply, slowly, letting your shoulders finally loosen, allowing your body to sink into the imagined weight of heavy blankets. This long journey through the medieval winters has been a tiring one, hasn't it? You have trudged through smoke-filled cottages, drafty castles, steaming bathhouses, and joyous frost fairs on frozen rivers. You have sat with peasants and lords alike. You have shared warmth with monks, merchants, and neighbours. And through it all, you have discovered that warmth was never just about the fire. It was about persistence, about finding those small, precious victories against the cold, about never, ever letting the last ember die. Let your mind wander back over those images one final time as you drift. The small child carrying a precious ember in a clay pot, the unique, earthy smell of peat smoke curling into a cottage, the rich shimmer of tapestries glowing in the firelight, the sound of laughter echoing across a frozen river. Each one is a single thread, woven together into a vast quilt of memory and human history. And as you lie here now, you can wrap yourself in that quilt, knowing that humanity has always found a way to endure. The cold outside your own window may be real, or perhaps it is only in your imagination tonight. Either way, you are safe here, in this moment. You are sheltered by walls, by these words, by centuries of stories that remind you survival is never a solitary act. People have always huddled close, whispered charms, shared their coals, and spun tales together in the darkness. And you, listening now, are a part of that same unbroken chain. So let your breath grow slower, your thoughts lighter. The fire is low, the night is kind, and you can drift at last into a warmth that is deeper than any hearth. Sleep well and dream softly.